They built Mauthausen to break men, but they built Gusen to erase them. On paper, Gusen was only a subcamp, an extension of the granite fortress above the Danube. It did not carry the same name. It did not appear first in reports. It stood in the shadow of its parent camp. And yet, within a few years, Gusen would become deadlier than Mauthausen itself. More men died there, faster, with less record, and with even less chance of survival. Gusen was not just a place of punishment. It was an experiment in acceleration where forced labor met industrial expansion, where human exhaustion became a production strategy, and where mortality was not an accident, but an accepted calculation. Quarries turned into tunnel factories. Factories turned into underground weapons plants. And prisoners became raw material for the Nazi war machine. Starvation, exposure, quarry labor, tunnel construction, aircraft assembly deep beneath the earth, and a system that replaced the dying with new transports before the bodies were cold. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Birth of a Subcamp. Gusen did not begin as a name meant to stand alone. It began as an extension, an afterthought on administrative charts, a line item beneath Mauthausen. Yet from the moment the SS surveyed the land near the small Austrian village of St. Georgen and der Gusen in 1939, the intentions were already clear. This would not simply be overflow space, but a place where labor could be extracted with even fewer limitations and even less visibility than the granite fortress above the Danube. The Anschluss of Austria in 1938 had folded the region into the Reich, and with it came the immediate exploitation of natural resources, especially the rich granite quarries that Nazi architects prized for monumental building projects planned for Hitler's redesigned German cities. Mauthausen had already been classified as a Category 3 camp, the harshest level in the concentration camp system, reserved for prisoners considered beyond rehabilitation, men marked not merely for punishment but for destruction through labor, and yet even that brutality was not considered sufficient for the expanding ambitions of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office. As demand for stone increased and transports of prisoners multiplied following the invasion of Poland, planners concluded that a separate installation closer to the quarries would increase productivity while isolating the most expendable prisoners from the administrative core of Mauthausen. Thus Gusen I emerged, officially opened in May 1940, built largely by the very prisoners who would later die within its fences, men forced to construct barracks, guard towers, and perimeter wires while already weakened by starvation rations and violent discipline. From the beginning, Gusen's structure reflected its purpose. It was positioned directly adjacent to the quarry operations, minimizing time lost between roll call and labor, maximizing hours of extraction, and embedding punishment into geography itself. The camp was designed with stark efficiency. Wooden barracks crammed into confined rows, limited sanitation, and work details organized with industrial precision, because it was never intended to be a long-term holding facility. It was intended to consume bodies. Political prisoners from Poland formed a significant portion of the first transports, many of them intelligentsia, teachers, priests, and resistance figures arrested during the early occupation, men already targeted for elimination under policies aimed at dismantling Polish leadership. Their presence signaled something critical about Gusen's role. This was not merely an economic site but part of a broader ideological campaign to destroy perceived enemies of the Reich. Quarry labor at Gusen was relentless, the granite blocks weighing dozens of kilograms, prisoners hauling them under guard supervision while navigating uneven terrain slick with dust or ice depending on the season, and the pace was dictated not by human endurance but by quotas. Guards measured output in stone, not survival, and beatings were routine responses to slowing productivity. Unlike Mauthausen's infamous stairway of death, Gusen's brutality unfolded across wider quarry faces and transport lines. Yet the effect was similar, exhaustion compounded by hunger until collapse became inevitable. Administrative records began reflecting mortality rates that were startling even by concentration camp standards, but these numbers did not slow expansion. They justified it because replacement transports were always available. The Nazi system operated on the assumption that prisoners were renewable resources, and Gusen embodied that logic with chilling clarity. By late 1940, the camp population had swelled beyond its original design capacity, and overcrowding intensified disease, particularly dysentery and other infections exacerbated by poor sanitation. Food allocations remained minimal, often watery soup and coarse bread insufficient to sustain the caloric demands of quarry labor, and weakened prisoners quickly entered a cycle of decline that ended in the infirmary blocks. Spaces less for healing than for sorting those who would not recover. Yet even in this early phase, Gusen's administration began to differentiate itself from Mauthausen not by moderation but by escalation. Capos, often drawn from criminal prisoner categories, were empowered to enforce discipline with severe violence, creating a layered hierarchy of terror where prisoners themselves became instruments of control. This internalized brutality reduced the need for constant SS oversight while maintaining relentless pressure on work output. Reports from surviving inmates later described Gusen as a place where time compressed, where weeks felt like months because survival required constant vigilance against hunger, exhaustion, and random punishment. And still, expansion continued. The SS recognized that isolating particularly targeted groups at Gusen allowed Mauthausen to preserve its administrative appearance while delegating the most lethal conditions to its satellite. In effect, Gusen was becoming a laboratory for intensified exploitation, a proving ground where mortality thresholds were tested and normalized. The ideological and economic motives fused seamlessly. Granite for the Reich's architectural dreams, elimination of political opponents, and demonstration of absolute SS authority. By 1941, whispers within the camp system acknowledged what statistics were beginning to show. Gusen's death rate rivaled and in some months exceeded that of its parent camp. Yet no corrective measures were introduced. Instead, infrastructure improvements focused solely on increasing labor capacity. Barracks were expanded, prisoner transports diversified, and the distinction between punishment and annihilation blurred further. The birth of Gusen was therefore not an accident of overcrowding but a calculated extension of policy, a recognition that Mauthausen's brutality could be replicated and intensified if separated geographically and administratively. In this early stage, the camp still revolved primarily around stone, but the mechanisms being perfected, rapid turnover of prisoners, normalization of extreme mortality, and integration of forced labor into broader SS economic planning, would soon make Gusen something more than a subcamp. It would become a model for accelerated destruction, a place where the calculus of labor and death tipped decisively toward annihilation. And so, what began in 1940 as an auxiliary quarry installation quietly laid the foundation for one of the deadliest labor complexes in the Nazi system, proving that within the hierarchy of camps, subordination did not mean lesser severity. It meant opportunity to intensify suffering away from the spotlight, to refine methods in relative obscurity, and to transform a satellite into a center of lethal efficiency. Chapter 1, Segment 2, Quarry Discipline and the Economy of Exhaustion. If Gusen's creation marked the beginning of intensified exploitation, its daily routine transformed that intention into a system of measurable destruction, where exhaustion was not an unfortunate consequence but the central operating principle, and every sunrise signaled another calculated reduction of human strength. The granite quarries surrounding the camp were not merely workplaces. They were engines of attrition, vast open wounds carved into the landscape where prisoners descended before dawn under the watch of armed guards, their silhouettes moving through mist and cold toward a labor site that offered no shelter from weather or violence. The stone extracted here fed the ambitions of the Reich's architectural fantasies, monumental buildings envisioned for Berlin and other cities, Yet the grandeur imagined on drafting tables was built upon the slow collapse of bodies below. Prisoners were organized into work detachments, each assigned specific tasks: drilling, blasting, cutting, hauling, and loading massive granite blocks that required coordinated effort even under optimal conditions, which Gusen never provided. Malnutrition hollowed muscles, and rations remained fixed at starvation levels despite the physical demands, creating a brutal paradox where the weaker a prisoner became, the harsher the punishments for failing to meet quotas. Productivity charts governed discipline. If a detachment fell behind, beatings followed, often public and indiscriminate, reinforcing the message that output outweighed survival. Capos enforced these expectations with ruthless efficiency, incentivized by privileges that depended on maintaining order and meeting targets. And this delegated cruelty allowed the SS to claim administrative distance while ensuring the violence never paused. The terrain itself amplified suffering, with uneven ground that caused frequent falls under heavy loads, and winter turned quarry surfaces into icy hazards where a single misstep could mean broken bones or immediate execution for sabotage. Unlike camps structured around immediate extermination facilities, Gusen's lethality was embedded in repetition. There was no single moment of annihilation, only a relentless accumulation of depletion that drained prisoners day by day. Medical care was nominal at best. The infirmary functioned as a triage space where those deemed too weak for labor were often left without treatment, their fate sealed by administrative indifference. Disease spread easily in overcrowded barracks, where sanitation facilities were insufficient and water scarce, and epidemics found fertile ground among men already compromised by hunger. Mortality statistics from this period reveal a steady escalation, particularly among Polish political prisoners, whose deliberate targeting underscored the ideological function of the camp. The SS considered them irredeemable adversaries, and quarry labor became a mechanism to eliminate them without the logistical visibility of mass shootings. At roll calls, which could last hours regardless of weather, prisoners stood motionless while counts were verified and punishments announced, further draining limited energy reserves before labor even began. The structure of the day was engineered to leave no margin for recovery. Early wake-up, minimal breakfast, march to quarry, continuous work punctuated by shouted commands, return march, evening roll call, and a final ration before collapsing onto wooden bunks crowded with dozens of others. Sleep offered little relief, as lice infestations and persistent hunger interrupted rest, ensuring that each morning began with a deficit. Yet within this regime of exhaustion, subtle patterns emerged that distinguished Gusen from its parent camp. The proximity to quarry operations reduced transit time but also eliminated any psychological buffer between confinement and labor. The camp and the worksite were effectively the same space, reinforcing the message that imprisonment and production were inseparable. Additionally, administrative correspondence indicates that Gusen's leadership pushed for expanded quarry capacity, requesting additional tools and explosives while showing no comparable concern for prisoner welfare. This imbalance highlights a crucial truth. In Gusen, the economic value of extracted granite was weighed against the expendability of human life, and the latter consistently lost. As the war progressed and the demand for construction materials shifted, the camp's infrastructure remained adaptable, prepared to pivot toward new forms of industrial exploitation. But even before those transitions, the quarry phase alone established Gusen's reputation among inmates as a place where survival odds were slimmer than at Mauthausen. Testimonies from survivors often describe the psychological toll of knowing that collapse meant not hospitalization but selection for death, either through neglect or direct execution. Some prisoners attempted to support one another by sharing scraps of food or offering brief assistance when lifting stone, small acts of solidarity that defied the system's intention to isolate and weaken, yet these gestures rarely altered outcomes in the face of structural brutality. The SS exploited internal divisions, assigning certain nationalities or prisoner categories to supervisory roles to prevent unified resistance, reinforcing fragmentation as a tool of control. In effect, quarry discipline at Gusen was not chaotic cruelty but organized attrition, a process refined through daily enforcement and bureaucratic oversight. Reports traveled upward through SS economic offices, detailing output figures that validated the camp's continuation and expansion. Each successful shipment of granite reinforced the perception that the model worked. Labor could be extracted until death without disrupting supply chains. And so, by late 1941, Gusen had solidified its identity not merely as a satellite of Mauthausen but as a prototype for intensified labor exploitation, where the convergence of ideology and industry produced mortality at a rate that signaled something deeper than neglect. It revealed a deliberate recalibration of acceptable loss. In this recalibration lay the seeds of what would follow, because once a camp demonstrates that death through labor can operate efficiently and without external scrutiny, the threshold for further escalation lowers. Quarry discipline had proven that exhaustion itself could serve as execution, and in Gusen, the economy of exhaustion was becoming the defining principle, a system so relentless that the distinction between work and killing dissolved into a single continuous process, measured not in hours but in the diminishing breadth of those forced to lift stone until they no longer could. Chapter 1, Segment 3, The First Wave of Mortality. By the time Gusen entered its second year of operation, the quarry had already claimed thousands of lives. Yet what made this phase uniquely lethal was not a sudden spike of visible violence but the quiet normalization of death as an administrative expectation, where mortality rates were recorded with the same procedural detachment as tool inventories and stone shipments. The early transports, many composed of Polish intellectuals, teachers, clergy, and political leaders arrested after the invasion of Poland, had been deliberately targeted for destruction through labor, and Gusen provided the ideal environment for that objective because its routines required no extraordinary measures beyond the enforcement of exhaustion. Prisoners arrived malnourished from transit, disoriented, and immediately subjected to processing rituals that stripped identity and imposed hierarchy. Shaved heads, confiscated belongings, assignment of numbers, and categorization by colored triangles that signified political or racial status. From the moment of registration, the odds were calibrated against them. Barracks built for limited capacity rapidly became overcrowded, forcing men to share narrow wooden bunks stacked in tiers, where disease spread easily and personal space vanished. Hygiene deteriorated under insufficient water supplies, and latrine facilities failed to match the growing population, creating conditions ripe for dysentery and other infections that compounded the toll of labor. What distinguished this mortality from the extermination camps further east was its diffusion across time. Death did not erupt in a single event but accumulated incrementally, often unnoticed outside camp boundaries. The infirmary, ostensibly designed for recovery, functioned as a holding area for those deemed unfit for quarry work, yet selection processes often redirected the weakest toward punitive assignments or execution under the guise of discipline. Records from this period indicate that many prisoners died within weeks of arrival, their bodies transported to cremation facilities without ceremony, reinforcing the understanding that replacement transports would soon replenish labor shortages. This cycle, arrival, depletion, death, replacement, became the structural rhythm of Gusen's first mortality wave. SS leadership recognized that the quarry's demands exceeded sustainable human capacity, but rather than adjusting workloads or rations, they recalibrated intake numbers, ensuring that productivity remained constant even as individual lives were expended. The deliberate imbalance between caloric intake and caloric expenditure ensured that prisoners entered a downward spiral from which recovery was nearly impossible. Hunger sharpened tempers, weakened immune systems, and eroded the strength required to lift granite blocks, while punishment for slowing down accelerated decline. Public beatings served as both spectacle and warning, reinforcing compliance among those who still possessed enough strength to fear consequences. Winter intensified these dynamics. Snow and freezing rain transformed the quarry into a treacherous expanse where frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and inadequate clothing offered little protection. Those who faltered in the cold were often left where they fell until roll call, a visible testament to the camp's indifference. Yet the administrative language describing these deaths remained sanitized, attributing fatalities to natural causes or heart failure, phrases that concealed the systematic deprivation underpinning them. In correspondence between camp officials and higher SS economic offices, mortality statistics were acknowledged but rarely framed as problematic. Instead, they were treated as operational data points within a larger production strategy. This bureaucratic framing insulated decision-makers from confronting the human reality of their policies, allowing quarry output to remain the primary measure of success. Survivors later described the psychological impact of this first mortality wave as profound, noting how quickly hope dissolved when new arrivals realized that the average lifespan inside Gusen could be measured in months rather than years. Solidarity networks attempted to mitigate despair, sharing fragments of bread or exchanging whispered information about survival tactics. Yet the structural conditions limited the effectiveness of such efforts. Capos, themselves prisoners granted limited authority, often intensified brutality to maintain status, creating an internal hierarchy that fragmented unity and deepened vulnerability. The result was a camp environment where trust eroded alongside physical strength, and where death became both omnipresent and strangely routine. As graves filled and crematoria operated continuously, Gusen's reputation spread through the wider Mauthausen complex, earning a grim designation among inmates as the place from which few returned. This reputation was not accidental. It reflected the deliberate concentration of the harshest labor assignments and the least sustainable living conditions within Gusen's boundaries. By late 1941, the mortality rate had surpassed that of many comparable labor camps, signaling that Gusen was evolving beyond a mere satellite facility into a distinct epicenter of lethal exploitation. The first wave of mortality thus served as both proof of concept and precedent. It demonstrated that large-scale death could be achieved without gas chambers, without mass shootings in open fields, and without the logistical spectacle of extermination centers. Instead, it could unfold through scheduling, rationing, quota enforcement, and the calculated denial of recovery. In this way, Gusen's early years established a template for attritional killing that would intensify as the war progressed and industrial demands shifted. The men who perished during this period became the unrecorded foundation of a system that measured success in cubic meters of granite while silently subtracting human lives from its ledgers. And as the camp prepared to expand its industrial role beyond stone, the lessons learned during this first mortality wave would inform subsequent phases, ensuring that the principle of expendability remained central. Gusen had proven that labor alone, when weaponized through policy, could achieve destruction at scale, and the administrative calm with which this truth was absorbed set the stage for even greater lethality in the years to follow, when underground factories and intensified production would amplify a system already accustomed to turning work into death. Chapter 2, Segment 1, Expansion Beyond the Quarry, the Birth of Gusen II. By 1942, the logic that had governed Gusen's first years, extraction through exhaustion, began to evolve not toward mercy, but toward industrial escalation, as the demands of total war reshaped the camp's function from quarry supplier to integrated arm of the Reich's armaments network. And with that transformation came the creation of Gusen II, a development that would intensify mortality while embedding the camp more deeply into the Nazi war economy. The shift did not occur overnight. It unfolded through a series of decisions made far from the quarry itself, in offices where planners confronted the increasing vulnerability of German industry to Allied bombing and sought ways to shield production beneath layers of earth and stone. The granite hills around Gusen, once valued solely for their stone, now offered another advantage: natural cover for underground facilities. As aircraft factories in major cities came under threat, SS and industrial leaders began exploring the relocation of sensitive manufacturing operations to hidden tunnels, and Gusen's existing infrastructure of forced labor made it an ideal candidate for expansion. Thus, what had begun as a quarry camp began to sprout new barracks, new perimeters, and new work details oriented not toward open-air extraction but toward the carving of vast subterranean chambers. Prisoners were reassigned from stone hauling to tunnel excavation, a task no less punishing and often more lethal, as they labored in poorly ventilated spaces filled with dust, blasting fumes, and unstable rock faces. The construction of Gusen II formalized this shift, marking the camp's transformation into a dual-purpose complex where quarry work and underground industrial preparation coexisted, each feeding the same system of expendability. Overcrowding intensified as transports increased, bringing in prisoners from across occupied Europe, Poles, Soviet POWs, French resistance members, and others deemed politically dangerous or racially undesirable. The camp's population swelled beyond sustainable limits, yet housing expansions lagged behind arrivals, forcing men into increasingly cramped quarters where bunks were shared in shifts and personal belongings shrank to a blanket and a bowl. The SS administration responded not by moderating intake but by standardizing attrition, calculating that deaths would offset overcrowding in due course. Rations remained calibrated for survival only under minimal exertion. Even as labor demands escalated, caloric deficits widened, and visible emaciation became commonplace within weeks of arrival. In the tunnels, work crews operated around the clock, divided into shifts that blurred day and night, severing any remaining connection to natural rhythms. Electric lighting cast harsh shadows against raw stone walls, while drilling equipment echoed continuously, amplifying psychological strain. Accidents multiplied as exhausted men mishandled tools or stumbled under debris, yet medical support remained perfunctory, limited to basic triage designed to return workers to duty as quickly as possible. Those deemed incapable were transferred back to surface details or to the infirmary, where survival prospects were slim. What distinguished Gusen II from its predecessor was not merely the environment of labor but its proximity to high-value industrial projects, which introduced a new layer of oversight from armaments officials eager to ensure productivity. Civilian engineers and company representatives occasionally appeared within the camp perimeter, inspecting progress while relying on SS discipline to maintain order. This collaboration blurred lines between military necessity and ideological cruelty, embedding private industry into a system sustained by coercion and death. As underground chambers expanded, they began to house assembly lines for aircraft components, integrating prisoners directly into the machinery of war. The physical toll of tunnel work proved devastating. Inhalation of fine dust led to respiratory ailments, damp conditions fostered infections, and the absence of sunlight weakened already fragile bodies. Yet the administrative language surrounding Gusen II emphasized output metrics rather than human cost, celebrating cubic meters excavated and production milestones achieved. Mortality rates climbed in tandem with industrial capacity, reinforcing the camp's emerging reputation as more lethal than its parent installation at Mauthausen. Guards enforced discipline with a combination of arbitrary violence and structured punishment, exploiting the claustrophobic environment to isolate and intimidate. Roll calls stretched for hours regardless of weather, ensuring that exhaustion carried over into work shifts. Winter again intensified suffering, as inadequate heating in barracks contrasted sharply with the damp chill of tunnels, where condensation dripped from ceilings onto sleeping bodies during rest periods between shifts. Solidarity networks attempted to adapt to the new conditions, sharing information about safer drilling techniques or trading positions within work details to distribute risk. Yet the scale of expansion diluted these efforts, as constant influxes of new prisoners disrupted established bonds. Gusen II thus represented not merely a physical enlargement but a conceptual deepening of the camp's function. It was no longer enough to extract stone. Now the camp itself became a hidden factory complex, its subterranean corridors symbolizing the Reich's attempt to bury both production and accountability. In this environment, mortality became even less visible to the outside world, concealed beneath layers of rock and secrecy. Bodies were removed through established channels, cremated or buried without ceremony, while new transports filled vacated bunks with chilling regularity. The transformation also signaled a shift in administrative priorities. Productivity now depended on maintaining a minimal level of prisoner viability, creating tension between the impulse toward rapid attrition and the need to sustain a labor force long enough to complete industrial objectives. This tension produced oscillations in policy, brief improvements in rations followed by renewed deprivation, sporadic medical attention offset by intensified quotas. Yet the underlying principle remained unchanged. Prisoners were tools, and tools were replaceable. By the end of 1942, Gusen II stood as a testament to the camp system's adaptability, demonstrating how structures of forced labor could pivot to meet strategic demands without relinquishing their lethal core. The quarry still claimed lives, but the tunnels now swallowed them in greater numbers, marking the beginning of a phase in which Gusen's identity would be inseparable from underground industry and the war economy it served. In this expansion lay the seeds of even greater mortality, as the camp's integration into armaments production ensured that its survival, and by extension the continuation of its brutality, was tied directly to the Reich's military fortunes, binding human suffering to the arc of a war that was far from over. Chapter 2, Segment 2, Underground Industry and the Mechanics of Exhaustion. As Gusen II expanded deeper into the hillsides of Upper Austria, the camp entered a new phase in which underground construction gave way to full industrial operation, transforming raw tunnels into structured production sites where aircraft components and weapons systems were assembled beneath layers of stone designed to shield them from Allied bombs. And in this transformation, the lethal calculus of the camp intensified because the demands of industrial precision collided with the physical collapse of the labor force forced to sustain it. What had begun as excavation now became routine manufacturing, with assembly lines installed inside vast caverns hollowed out by prisoner hands, electric cables strung along damp rock walls, ventilation systems added but rarely sufficient, and work schedules standardized to maintain continuous output. Yet beneath this veneer of order lay a system still defined by malnutrition, brutality, and disposability. Prisoners assigned to tunnel factories endured shifts that stretched 10, sometimes 12 hours, followed by roll calls and meager rest in overcrowded barracks, their bodies caught in a cycle where exhaustion accumulated faster than recovery could occur. Unlike the quarry, where death was visible in falls and beatings, the tunnels imposed a quieter erosion. Chronic hunger reduced muscle strength, dust inhalation damaged lungs, and the absence of sunlight weakened immune systems, producing a gradual attrition that administrators could measure only through rising infirmary admissions and decreasing productivity per man. Industrial managers demanded consistent output, and SS overseers responded by intensifying discipline, punishing perceived sabotage or slow work with beatings, confinement, or transfer to even harsher details, reinforcing the message that efficiency was valued above survival. The camp's medical facilities, never adequate, became overwhelmed by cases of respiratory illness, infections from untreated injuries, and the compounded effects of starvation. Triage decisions prioritized those who might return to work, while the weakest were left to decline. In this environment, mortality was not the product of a single catastrophic event but of a system that extracted every possible unit of labor until the worker collapsed, at which point replacement was immediate, drawn from new transports arriving with bureaucratic regularity. The integration of Gusen II into the armaments network also deepened collaboration between the SS and private industry, as engineers and technical supervisors visited production halls to inspect machinery, often maintaining deliberate distance from the human costs that underpin their projects, a separation that allowed them to treat the camp as an industrial site rather than a place of confinement. For the prisoners, however, the dual identity of the tunnels, as both workplace and prison, was inescapable. Armed guards patrolled entrances, barbed wire encircled the surface compounds, and the threat of punishment hovered over every interaction. The underground setting magnified psychological strain, as the monotony of artificial light and constant noise blurred temporal awareness, making days indistinguishable from nights and eroding any sense of progression toward liberation. Communication between shifts was limited but essential, with whispered exchanges about machinery malfunctions or minor acts of resistance circulating through networks that sought to preserve fragments of agency within an overwhelmingly coercive structure. Yet even these efforts were constrained by surveillance and the risk of collective punishment. As production quotas increased in response to wartime pressures, administrators recalibrated labor assignments, transferring prisoners between quarry and tunnel details to balance output, a practice that disrupted fragile support systems and exposed men to unfamiliar hazards. The camp's population swelled further as subcamps were established to feed the industrial complex, each extension replicating the same hierarchy of control, deprivation, and exploitation, ensuring that mortality rates remained high across the network. Records from this period reveal a grim symmetry. As aircraft components rolled off underground assembly lines, death tallies climbed, linking technological advancement to human depletion in a stark equation. Unlike extermination centers built solely for immediate killing, Gusen's lethality emerged from sustained overwork under conditions that made recovery impossible. The absence of gas chambers did not equate to mercy, for starvation, disease, and exhaustion functioned as mechanisms just as final, though slower in execution. Winter compounded these effects, as cold seeped into tunnels and barracks alike, forcing bodies already weakened by labor to expend scarce energy on warmth, while rations remained static or declined. Guards exploited fatigue to assert dominance, staging sudden inspections or prolonging roll calls, extending exposure to freezing air and reinforcing the unpredictability that characterized camp life. Amid this environment, mortality statistics began to distinguish Gusen from Mauthausen proper, as the sustained industrial demands of the tunnels generated death rates that rivaled, and in some periods exceeded, those of the parent camp. The SS administration responded not by reassessing conditions but by refining record-keeping, ensuring that losses were categorized efficiently and replacements requested without delay, a bureaucratic rhythm that normalized disappearance. Bodies were transported to crematoria with procedural regularity, their passage documented in ledgers that reduced identities to numbers. For survivors, the awareness that they were part of a production chain in which their own depletion was factored into planning added a layer of existential weight. They were not merely prisoners but components in a system designed to consume them. As Allied air raids intensified across Europe, the strategic importance of underground facilities increased, reinforcing the camp's value to the Reich and prolonging its operation despite mounting evidence of Germany's deteriorating position. Thus, Gusen II became emblematic of a broader wartime strategy: to burrow deeper, to conceal industry within earth and stone, and to sustain output regardless of human cost. Within this concealed world, the mechanics of exhaustion operated with relentless consistency, transforming labor into a drawn-out sentence that ended only when the body failed completely. By the time 1943 progressed toward its end, the tunnels of Gusen II were no longer experimental expansions but fully integrated arms of the Nazi war economy, their humming machinery underscored by the steady cadence of attrition, setting the stage for further escalation as new sections of the complex emerged and the line between industrial ambition and systematic destruction grew ever thinner. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Expansion into Gusen III and the System of Total Exploitation. As Gusen I and II solidified their roles within the expanding machinery of forced labor, the logic that governed their operation did not slow. It accelerated, and with that acceleration came the creation of Gusen III, a further extension of the complex that demonstrated how the camp system adapted continuously to the needs of war, reshaping geography, manpower, and mortality into a single coordinated structure whose sole priority was output regardless of cost. Gusen III did not emerge as an isolated camp but as a functional limb of an already lethal organism, positioned strategically to serve nearby industrial installations and to absorb the overflow of prisoners whose bodies were still deemed usable but whose survival prospects had already narrowed to the thinnest margin. By this stage in the war, the Reich's industrial desperation was unmistakable, and underground production sites multiplied across occupied territories. Yet in Gusen, expansion meant intensification rather than relief. New barracks were erected with minimal materials and even less regard for sanitation, housing men in numbers far beyond the intended capacity, compressing human space to such an extent that sleep itself became a competitive act, fought for on wooden bunks stacked 3 high, where disease traveled faster than any guard's command. The SS administration treated this overcrowding not as a crisis but as a resource, calculating labor potential in ratios that assumed inevitable attrition and built it into logistical planning, ensuring that transport lists were updated regularly to compensate for those who collapsed under strain. Gusen III's labor assignments reflected the evolving priorities of the war economy, with prisoners dispatched to satellite factories, construction sites, and repair workshops tied directly to armament production. Their days structured by whistle blasts and roll calls that marked the beginning and end of grueling shifts whose length rarely corresponded to physical endurance. Unlike earlier phases of quarry labor that emphasized brute extraction, this new stage demanded both physical stamina and technical repetition, yet training was minimal and errors, often caused by exhaustion, were punished as sabotage, reinforcing a climate of fear that blurred the distinction between incompetence and resistance. Supervisors from industrial firms inspected progress while maintaining emotional and administrative distance from the camp's human realities, participating in a division of responsibility that allowed efficiency to coexist with cruelty without overt confrontation. The geography of Gusen III, fragmented across work sites, created additional hazards. Long marches to and from labor details exposed prisoners to weather extremes, and weakened men frequently stumbled on uneven ground, sometimes beaten back to their feet, sometimes left behind to be recorded later as deceased. Nutrition continued to decline as supply chains faltered under Allied bombing, and rations that had once barely sustained life now failed even to stabilize weight, producing skeletal frames whose capacity for sustained labor diminished by the week. Infirmaries, overwhelmed and under-resourced, functioned less as centers of healing and more as holding spaces for those temporarily removed from work, and the line between the sick and the condemned narrowed to a point where recovery was rare and discharge often meant immediate reassignment to the harshest tasks. Administrative reports from this period reveal a chilling normalization of death rates, with fluctuations analyzed not in moral terms but in relation to production output, as though mortality were a variable cost of operation. Within this framework, Gusen III became not merely an auxiliary camp but a symbol of how the system could replicate itself, scaling up brutality in proportion to industrial need. The interconnectedness of the 3 Gusen sections, shared guards, coordinated transports, unified command, ensured that lessons in discipline and exploitation flowed freely between them, refining techniques of control and reinforcing hierarchies among prisoners through the use of capos and internal policing that further fragmented solidarity. Yet despite fragmentation, networks of quiet support persisted, with men sharing fragments of bread or passing whispered information about impending transfers, small gestures that defied the camp's objective of total isolation. As 1944 approached and the military situation deteriorated for Germany, the influx of new prisoners from evacuated eastern camps intensified pressure on Gusen III's infrastructure, swelling numbers beyond manageable limits and amplifying disease outbreaks that swept through barracks already saturated with weakness. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections found fertile ground among malnourished bodies, and quarantine measures were sporadic and ineffective, subordinated to production demands that could not pause for containment. In this environment, the difference between life and death often hinged on arbitrary assignments or fleeting physical resilience, underscoring the randomness embedded within systemic cruelty. The SS, aware of the camp's rising death toll, did not fundamentally alter policy. Instead, they adjusted documentation procedures, ensuring that bodies were processed efficiently and that labor rosters remained filled. Crematoria and burial details worked continuously, their grim tasks another link in the chain that bound the three camps together. Gusen III thus completed the transformation of the complex into one of the most lethal forced labor networks within the Nazi camp system, not because it was designed explicitly for immediate extermination, but because it perfected the conversion of human energy into expendable output under conditions engineered to ensure depletion. By the final year of the war, the cumulative effect of quarry extraction, tunnel construction, and dispersed industrial labor had created a landscape where survival required an extraordinary combination of luck, endurance, and mutual aid, and where death was so routine that it blended into the daily rhythm of whistles, marches, and machinery. In understanding Gusen III's role, one sees not an aberration but the logical extension of a philosophy that equated human worth with productivity and deemed exhaustion an acceptable instrument of policy. The expansion that created this third section did not mark a deviation from the parent camp's principles. It marked their fulfillment, demonstrating how the system could multiply itself across terrain and time, embedding lethal exploitation deeper into the fabric of the Reich's final years, and leaving behind a record of attrition that would later force historians to confront the uncomfortable truth that some of the deadliest killing did not require chambers or gunfire, only the relentless scheduling of work under conditions designed to consume those who performed it. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Mortality, Measurement, and the Mathematics of Death. By the time Gusen's three sections were fully integrated into the wider Mauthausen complex, death was no longer an unexpected outcome of brutal conditions. It had become an anticipated variable, calculated into the rhythm of the camp's daily administration, tracked in ledgers, summarized in reports, and quietly accepted as the cost of maintaining production quotas that never adjusted to human limits. To understand how Gusen became deadlier than its parent camp, one must examine not only the physical suffering endured within its boundaries, but the cold arithmetic that shaped decision-making at every level of command, transforming mortality from a moral catastrophe into an operational statistic. The SS administration maintained meticulous records of prisoner numbers, labor assignments, and deaths. Yet these records were not instruments of accountability. They were tools for logistical planning. When death rates rose in one section, transports were scheduled to replenish the workforce. When disease thinned the ranks of skilled laborers, replacements were drawn from new arrivals or transferred from other camps. The system did not falter under loss. It adapted, absorbing each fatality into a cycle of replacement that concealed the cumulative devastation behind the steady continuation of work details. In Gusen I, II, and III, this process operated with particular intensity because the labor demanded there quarry extraction, tunnel excavation, underground construction, and weapons assembly consumed physical strength at a pace that far exceeded the caloric intake provided to sustain it. Prisoners burned more energy in a single shift than their daily rations could possibly restore, creating a predictable trajectory of decline. Weight loss, muscle deterioration, susceptibility to infection, and eventual collapse. Medical evaluations, when conducted, did not interrupt this trajectory. Instead, they often accelerated it, categorizing weakened prisoners as unfit and transferring them to less visible labor or directly to facilities where death followed swiftly. Mortality statistics from Gusen reveal patterns that differ sharply from those of Mauthausen's central camp, not merely in numbers but in concentration, with certain months reflecting spikes that coincided with industrial surges or mass arrivals from evacuated camps in the east. These spikes were not anomalies but indicators of a system under strain, prioritizing output over survival as the war intensified and resources dwindled. The winter months were especially lethal, as insufficient clothing and heating compounded malnutrition, leaving men vulnerable to frostbite and respiratory illnesses that spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks. Yet even in summer, when temperatures rose and work hours extended, heat exhaustion and dehydration claimed additional lives, proving that season offered little protection against attrition. The administrative language used to describe these deaths further illustrates the normalization of mortality. Phrases such as natural causes or weakness obscured the structural violence embedded in daily routines, framing death as inevitable rather than engineered. Industrial partners operating within the Gusen complex rarely intervened to address these outcomes. Instead, they adjusted workflows to compensate for reduced manpower, sometimes requesting additional transports to maintain production targets. In this interplay between camp command and civilian industry, responsibility diffused across institutional boundaries, ensuring that no single entity appeared solely accountable while all benefited from the exploitation. The measurement of productivity often overshadowed the measurement of survival, with reports emphasizing cubic meters of stone extracted or components assembled, rather than the bodies required to achieve those figures. In effect, Gusen functioned as a laboratory in which the relationship between labor intensity and mortality was continuously tested, revealing a grim correlation. As output expectations increased, life expectancy decreased. New arrivals, particularly those already weakened by prior imprisonment, entered a system calibrated to exhaust them quickly, and the average survival time in certain labor detachments could be counted not in years but in months or even weeks. This accelerated mortality distinguished Gusen from many other camps, where brutality was severe but not always synchronized so precisely with industrial tempo. The structure of the Gusen complex, fragmented into multiple sections yet unified under a single command, allowed for flexibility in distributing prisoners to the harshest assignments, ensuring that no single barracks absorbed the full impact of attrition, while the overall death rate continued to climb. Within the prisoner population, awareness of these patterns fostered a grim understanding that assignment to certain work details was tantamount to a sentence, and informal networks sometimes attempted to shield the weakest from the most lethal tasks, though success was limited by the scale of suffering and the vigilance of guards. Disease outbreaks, particularly typhus and dysentery, magnified the toll, thriving in conditions where sanitation collapsed under overcrowding and where access to clean water was inconsistent. The camp's infirmaries, overwhelmed and under-equipped, often served as transitional spaces between labor and death, offering minimal treatment and returning patients to work before recovery was complete. In the final phase of the war, as evacuation transports from other camps flooded into Gusen, mortality accelerated further, with numbers exceeding the capacity of crematoria and burial details struggling to keep pace. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be processed, and the visible presence of death became an inescapable aspect of daily life, reinforcing the perception among prisoners that survival depended as much on chance as on endurance. Yet within the administrative structure, the cycle persisted. Deaths were recorded, replacements assigned, quotas reaffirmed. This relentless repetition reveals the deeper mechanism by which Gusen became deadlier than Mauthausen, not through a singular policy of extermination, but through the steady application of labor demands calibrated to exceed human capacity. The mathematics of death did not require gas chambers to produce staggering losses. It required only a system in which human beings were reduced to units of productivity and where the depletion of those units triggered logistical adjustment rather than ethical reflection. By examining the data alongside survivor testimony, one perceives how numbers and narratives converge, each illuminating the other. The statistics quantify the scale, while the memories restore individuality to those subsumed within columns of figures. In this convergence lies the true measure of Gusen's lethality, a camp complex that transformed attrition into routine, integrated mortality into planning, and demonstrated with chilling clarity how a modern administrative apparatus could render mass death both systematic and sustainable. Chapter 3, Segment 2: Industrial Acceleration and the Collapse of Human Limits. If mortality in Gusen can be traced through statistics and administrative reports, its acceleration must be understood through the transformation of the camp into an industrial engine whose appetite for labor grew more desperate as the war turned against Nazi Germany, binding the fate of prisoners to production schedules that intensified with every Allied advance and every bombing raid that disrupted factories elsewhere in the Reich. By 1943 and especially into 1944, the underground expansion projects beneath the hills near Gusen II and III shifted the center of gravity from open quarry labor to tunnel excavation and weapons manufacturing, creating environments where darkness, dust, and confinement compounded exhaustion in ways that made survival even more precarious than in the earlier quarry phases. The transfer of armaments production underground, particularly components for aircraft and advanced weaponry, demanded precision and speed from men who were already malnourished and chronically ill, forcing them into extended shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels where oxygen levels dropped, rock dust filled lungs, and lighting flickered against damp stone walls, turning each workday into a test of endurance that few could sustain for long. Industrial managers and SS overseers coordinated closely, recalibrating work teams when output lagged, punishing delays as if they were acts of sabotage rather than consequences of physical collapse, and insisting on quotas that reflected strategic urgency rather than human possibility. In these subterranean halls, the distinction between prisoner and machine blurred further, as the value assigned to a worker was measured almost entirely by his ability to maintain pace with drills, hammers, and assembly lines, and once that pace faltered, replacement followed swiftly from new transports arriving at an almost continuous rate. The expansion of Gusen's industrial role did not coincide with improvements in rations or medical care. On the contrary, as Germany's supply lines deteriorated and shortages spread, food portions shrank and quality declined, leaving prisoners with even fewer calories to offset the rising intensity of labor. This imbalance deepened the spiral of decline, with weakened bodies failing under tasks that demanded steady strength, and supervisors responding not by easing expectations but by increasing coercion, sometimes through public punishment meant to reinforce discipline among those still standing. The architecture of the underground complexes amplified psychological strain alongside physical exhaustion, as prisoners labored without clear sense of time, emerging into daylight only briefly before returning to cramped barracks where overcrowding erased any possibility of rest. Noise echoed constantly within the tunnels, metal striking stone, carts rolling along tracks, orders shouted in clipped tones, creating a sensory landscape that denied silence and eroded concentration, making accidents more frequent and injuries more severe. Such injuries often became death sentences in themselves, because treatment options were minimal and convalescence rare. Men with broken bones or severe lacerations were frequently returned to work prematurely or transferred to sections where mortality was already high. Meanwhile, the fragmentation of the Gusen complex into multiple sections allowed administrators to channel prisoners strategically, moving those deemed temporarily useful into technical roles while relegating the weakest to the most punishing excavation tasks, ensuring that attrition remained concentrated yet diffuse enough to avoid paralyzing any single operation. The scale of industrial ambition in Gusen II and III further entrenched this lethal dynamic, as the Reich's reliance on underground production meant that failure in these tunnels could not be tolerated, and the urgency to complete facilities before Allied forces advanced translated into relentless pressure on both guards and prisoners. Survivor accounts later described the tunnels as spaces where hope narrowed alongside the corridors, where air felt heavy and time indistinct, and where the sense of being consumed by the machinery of war was almost literal, as men carved cavities in rock that would house weapons designed to prolong a conflict already collapsing around them. In this context, mortality rates cannot be separated from industrial tempo. Spikes in deaths often aligned with phases of intensified excavation or assembly, suggesting a direct correlation between strategic demands and the depletion of human life. Even as crematoria struggled to process bodies and burial details worked under strain, production continued, demonstrating the system's capacity to compartmentalize death as background noise to industrial achievement. The presence of civilian engineers and corporate representatives in or near the camp complex added another layer to this dynamic, embedding the exploitation within broader economic networks and reinforcing the perception that Gusen's output mattered beyond its fences, tying the suffering of prisoners to contracts, deadlines, and military directives. By late 1944, As Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers across Germany, the significance of underground sites like Gusen increased, and with it, the willingness to drive prisoners harder despite the visible toll, creating conditions in which survival required not only physical resilience but also extraordinary luck in work assignments and health. The accelerated pace also intensified tensions within the prisoner population, as competition for slightly less lethal tasks sharpened and informal hierarchies shifted under the weight of scarcity, though acts of solidarity persisted in small gestures, sharing scraps of bread, warning one another of inspections, offering whispered encouragement amid the clatter of tools. Yet such solidarity could not alter the structural imbalance at the heart of Gusen's transformation: the deliberate prioritization of output over life. The industrial acceleration thus functioned as a multiplier of lethality, converting an already brutal labor camp into a nexus where strategic desperation intersected with administrative indifference, and where each increment in production carried an invisible ledger of human cost. As the war approached its final months and evacuation transports from other camps swelled Gusen's population further, the strain on resources and infrastructure reached breaking point. But rather than reducing workloads, authorities attempted to maintain or even escalate efforts, intensifying a cycle in which exhaustion led to mistakes, mistakes invited punishment, and punishment hastened death. In examining this period, one sees how Gusen's identity shifted from a harsh adjunct of Mauthausen to a central pillar of underground armaments production, and how that shift magnified mortality not through overt extermination orders but through the systematic disregard for limits imposed by the human body. The camp's deadliness emerged from this intersection of industrial ambition and ideological dehumanization, proving that when labor is weaponized and survival subordinated to strategic goals, a facility need not possess gas chambers to produce catastrophic loss. It need only sustain a tempo that treats collapse as acceptable collateral and replacement as routine, thereby embedding death within the very architecture of productivity. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Mortality as Policy and the Arithmetic of Expendability. By the time Gusen reached its peak lethality, death was no longer an unintended consequence of harsh conditions. It had become an accepted outcome within an administrative system that calculated loss against output and found the exchange tolerable, even efficient, revealing how mortality could be absorbed into policy without explicit extermination orders. The classification of prisoners, the allocation of rations, the assignment of labor details, and the rotation between quarry, tunnel, and factory work were all filtered through an internal logic that measured utility in narrow, temporary terms, ensuring that as soon as a body weakened beyond a minimal threshold, it shifted from asset to liability in the eyes of the camp hierarchy. This arithmetic of expendability did not require daily meetings to decide who would die. It functioned through routines that guaranteed attrition, reduced food for those in punishment blocks, denial of medical treatment for those deemed unlikely to recover quickly, and transfers to especially punishing details for individuals labeled unproductive. In Gusen, where industrial projects demanded relentless labor, such routines operated at a pace that amplified their lethal effect, and the camp's internal reports reflected a steady churn of numbers that masked personal histories behind columns of arrivals and deaths. Mortality rates climbed not only because of overwork and malnutrition but also because overcrowding intensified as transports from across occupied Europe converged on the complex, especially in the later years of the war when evacuations from eastern camps swelled the population beyond the capacity of barracks and sanitation systems. The breakdown of hygiene and the spread of disease, typhus, dysentery, respiratory infections aggravated by dust, created another layer of attrition that administrators addressed not by easing workloads but by isolating the sick in makeshift infirmaries where resources were scarce and recovery uncertain. Selection for work details often meant the difference between short-term survival and rapid decline, yet even those placed in technical roles within the tunnels or assembly areas faced hazards that could quickly undo any advantage. Falling rock, machinery accidents, and exposure to toxic fumes compounded exhaustion and rendered injury commonplace. Within this environment, the presence of Gusen II and III as extensions of the original camp intensified the diffusion of responsibility, as different sections developed reputations for particular levels of brutality or mortality, but all remained bound by the same structural premise that labor trumped life. The comparison with Mauthausen reveals how this arithmetic evolved. While both camps enforced death through labor, Gusen's integration into underground armaments production and its swelling population created a density of suffering that translated into higher proportional losses, especially during peak construction phases and the chaotic final months before liberation. Executions and punitive killings certainly occurred, public hangings, shootings for alleged sabotage, and brutal reprisals meant to deter resistance, but the greater share of deaths resulted from the slow violence of policy, from caloric deficits that never closed, from shifts that extended beyond endurance, and from administrative indifference to the cumulative toll of such practices. Even as the Reich's collapse loomed and supply lines faltered, the machinery of Gusen continued to function with grim determination, reflecting a system that prioritized completion of tunnels and production quotas over the preservation of any individual life. The arrival of high-profile prisoners, including political figures and resistance members from across Europe, underscored the camp's expanding role within the broader Nazi apparatus, yet their presence did not moderate conditions. Rather, it demonstrated how diverse categories of prisoners could be folded into the same lethal calculus once marked for confinement. Survivor testimony later described a pervasive sense that survival hinged on constant recalibration, securing a slightly less punishing task, avoiding notice during inspections, conserving fragments of strength for the climb back to barracks. But even such strategies could be undone by illness or arbitrary reassignment, highlighting the fragility of any reprieve within a system built on attrition. As mortality mounted, burial details struggled to keep pace, and cremation facilities operated under strain, yet production deadlines persisted, revealing a chilling consistency in priorities. Output remained visible and measurable, whereas loss could be recorded as an abstract figure detached from immediate consequence. The arithmetic of expendability thus operated on multiple levels: economic, ideological, and administrative, each reinforcing the others to normalize death as background to industrial achievement. Ideologically, prisoners had been defined as enemies whose suffering carried no moral weight. Economically, their labor was treated as a resource to be extracted until depletion. Administratively, their replacement through new transports ensured continuity of function even as individuals disappeared. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced and the camp system began to fracture, the lethal calculus intensified rather than eased, with overcrowding reaching extreme levels and rations shrinking further, turning the final months into a crescendo of deprivation that erased any lingering distinction between those newly arrived and those long imprisoned. Evacuation plans added another layer of peril, as prisoners were forced into marches under winter conditions or crammed into transports that magnified exposure and starvation, extending the logic of expendability beyond the camp's fences and into the collapsing landscape of the Reich. When liberation finally approached, what emerged was not merely evidence of brutality but a stark illustration of how sustained policy choices, each seemingly administrative, each justified within the internal logic of war and ideology, could converge into a mortality rate that surpassed even the already grim standards of its parent camp. In understanding how Gusen became deadlier than Mauthausen, one must therefore look beyond isolated acts of cruelty and examine the cumulative weight of decisions that treated exhaustion as acceptable, sickness as incidental, and death as a manageable statistic, because it was within this arithmetic that the camp's lethal identity was forged. The tragedy of Gusen lies not only in the number who perished but in the clarity with which it demonstrates that mass death can emerge from the steady application of policies that strip individuals of worth and measure success solely by productivity, turning a labor complex into a landscape where life expectancy contracted in proportion to industrial ambition and where the final balance sheet recorded human loss as a silent, expendable cost of war. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Underground Shift Industry Beneath the Earth. By 1943, as Allied bombers increasingly targeted German industrial centers, the logic of exploitation at Gusen took on a new dimension, descending beneath the surface of the earth into vast tunnel systems carved by prisoners whose labor would redefine the camp's scale of suffering, because what had begun as a quarry complex gradually transformed into an underground armaments hub where exhaustion became inseparable from strategic necessity and mortality rose in direct proportion to industrial urgency. The decision to relocate critical weapons production underground was not merely defensive. It represented a calculated intensification of forced labor, and Gusen, particularly Gusen II, became central to this transformation as thousands of prisoners were driven into mountainsides to hollow out chambers large enough to house assembly lines for aircraft components and advanced weapons projects. These tunnels, damp and unventilated, were blasted from solid rock with minimal safety measures, and prisoners worked in rotating shifts that erased any distinction between day and night, emerging only briefly before being sent back into darkness, their lungs filling with dust and fumes while their bodies weakened under rations that could not sustain such exertion. The underground environment magnified every existing deprivation. Air circulation was poor, lighting was harsh or inadequate, sanitation nearly non-existent, and the constant echo of drills and detonations disoriented those already pushed beyond endurance, creating a psychological claustrophobia layered atop physical decline. Injuries multiplied as rockfalls and machinery accidents became commonplace, yet medical facilities were ill-equipped to address trauma, and those unable to return quickly to work were frequently marked for transfer or punishment, reinforcing the message that productivity alone conferred temporary protection. Unlike open-air quarries, where collapse might at least allow the sky to remain visible, the tunnels imposed a different form of erasure, enclosing prisoners within a man-made labyrinth whose sole purpose was to sustain a war effort that increasingly relied on coerced bodies as expendable inputs. Industrial firms contracted with SS authorities to utilize this labor, embedding Gusen more deeply into the Nazi war economy and blurring the line between camp administration and corporate ambition, because the underground factories were not peripheral experiments but essential components of late-war production strategies, particularly in the manufacture of aircraft fuselages and advanced weapon systems. This integration intensified quotas and shortened timelines, as engineers and overseers measured progress in meters of tunnel completed and units assembled, while the human cost remained external to the calculation, absorbed by a system already conditioned to treat mortality as routine attrition. Overcrowding worsened as transports from across occupied Europe continued to arrive, feeding the expanding industrial apparatus, and barracks built for far fewer inmates became sites of chronic deprivation, where bunks were shared in shifts and disease spread unchecked through bodies too malnourished to resist infection. The underground shift also altered patterns of discipline, as guards enforced silence and speed within confined spaces where minor delays could disrupt entire sections of construction, leading to beatings and summary punishments that echoed off stone walls and reverberated through the ranks of laborers who understood that even small infractions could cascade into fatal consequences. The presence of specialized prisoners, engineers, technicians, skilled workers did not alleviate conditions. Rather, it underscored how expertise could be exploited until exhaustion rendered it useless, after which replacement from incoming transports ensured continuity without mercy. As Allied forces advanced and bombing intensified elsewhere, the tunnels grew busier, not calmer, reflecting a paradox in which the Reich's shrinking territory demanded ever greater output from camps already operating at lethal capacity, and Gusen's underground complex became emblematic of this desperation, a subterranean world sustained by coercion and marked by mortality rates that rivaled or exceeded those of its parent camp. The shift beneath the earth thus signaled more than a logistical adaptation. It marked a turning point in which industrial ambition and systemic cruelty fused into a singular project, demonstrating how the camp's original quarry model of death through labor could be scaled and modernized to meet the demands of total war, while simultaneously accelerating the decline of those forced to power it. Even as rumors of impending defeat circulated among guards and prisoners alike, the machinery within the tunnels continued to operate, driven by orders that prioritized completion of weapons over preservation of life. And in this persistence lay a stark revelation. The underground expansion of Gusen was not a temporary expedient but a culmination of policies that had long equated human bodies with raw materials, capable of being consumed at whatever rate production required. By the time liberation approached, the tunnels stood as silent testimony to the convergence of engineering and exploitation, vast chambers etched into mountains by hands that seldom saw daylight, their existence a reminder that modern industry, when untethered from moral constraint, can transform landscapes and lives alike into instruments of destruction. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Mortality by Design, Numbers, Quotas, and Disposable Lives. As Gusen's industrial importance expanded, so too did the mathematical logic that governed survival within its fences, because by late 1943 and into 1944 the camp had evolved into a place where mortality was not merely tolerated but structurally embedded in the rhythm of production, and understanding how Gusen became deadlier than Mauthausen requires tracing how quotas, transport cycles, labor classifications, and rations intersected to create a system in which death functioned as an expected output. Prisoners were categorized according to perceived utility, and those assigned to the heaviest quarry or tunnel labor were often drawn from transports labeled politically dangerous or racially targeted, a designation that implicitly accepted short life expectancy as part of their allocation, meaning that from the moment of arrival many men were already positioned within a statistical framework that predicted their exhaustion. The daily schedule left little margin for recovery. Roll calls stretched for hours in freezing or sweltering weather, work shifts extended beyond 12 hours, and meager food portions, thin soup, a scrap of bread, occasional margarine, failed to replenish calories burned in blasting rock or hauling debris, so that weight loss became rapid and visible, ribs protruding beneath striped uniforms that offered scant protection against the elements. As bodies weakened, vulnerability to disease intensified, and outbreaks of dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis circulated through overcrowded barracks where ventilation was poor and sanitation overwhelmed. Yet medical intervention remained minimal, often limited to superficial examinations that determined whether a prisoner could still stand upright enough to return to work. Those deemed unfit were frequently transferred back to Mauthausen for execution or killed through injections and neglect within the camp system itself, reinforcing a grim feedback loop in which labor demands culled the weak and incoming transports replaced them, preserving output while erasing individuals. Mortality rates at Gusen rose accordingly, and while precise figures varied across subcamps and periods, contemporary accounts and post-war research consistently indicate that a disproportionate percentage of those sent to Gusen perished there, a pattern shaped by the convergence of harsher assignments, denser overcrowding, and the underground labor regime that accelerated physical decline beyond the already severe baseline of Mauthausen. The administrative paperwork that tracked prisoner numbers reveals an unsettling precision. Arrivals logged, transfers recorded, deaths noted with coded causes that obscured the cumulative impact of starvation and overwork. Yet these documents also expose how administrators anticipated continual loss and calculated workforce needs accordingly, requesting additional transports when attrition threatened productivity targets. In this sense, death was woven into planning, not as an accident but as an anticipated variable, a component of a system designed to sustain output even as it consumed its labor force. The concept of extermination through labor found particularly stark expression at Gusen, where the most dangerous assignments were deliberately paired with inadequate nourishment and relentless oversight, ensuring that only a fraction of prisoners survived long enough to adapt physically, and even those who did often carried permanent injuries or chronic illness that reduced their life expectancy beyond liberation. Punishments compounded these conditions as minor infractions, slowing pace, pausing to catch breath, collapsing under weight, could result in beatings or confinement that further weakened already depleted bodies, turning discipline into another mechanism of attrition. The expansion of subcamps amplified the problem, dispersing prisoners into satellite sites tied to armaments factories where supervision varied but deprivation remained constant, and coordination between these locations meant that individuals could be shuffled between brutal environments without respite, preventing any stable community from forming that might mitigate decline. As the war situation deteriorated and resources within Germany grew scarce, rations shrank further, and Gusen's mortality climbed in tandem, reflecting how late war shortages were absorbed disproportionately by those least able to resist. Their caloric intake reduced even as labor demands intensified. The numerical disparity between those who entered and those who left alive underscores the lethal efficiency of this arrangement. And when historians compare mortality percentages between Mauthausen and Gusen, the evidence points repeatedly toward Gusen's harsher conditions as a decisive factor, not because it housed gas chambers on the same scale as extermination centers, but because its industrial integration and underground labor created a sustained environment of accelerated exhaustion. In examining these patterns, one confronts a disturbing truth. Gusen did not require overt spectacles of mass execution to achieve catastrophic death tolls. It relied instead on structured deprivation calibrated to maximize productivity while minimizing longevity, a formula that converted human beings into expendable units within a logistical equation. By early 1945, as transports from evacuated eastern camps flooded into the complex, overcrowding surged once more, pushing mortality even higher and collapsing whatever fragile equilibrium had existed between work capacity and survival, so that barracks became spaces where dozens died nightly from starvation and disease, while the machinery of production still demanded completion of quotas. Thus, the deadliness of Gusen was not a sudden spike but the cumulative outcome of policies refined over years, policies that treated loss as predictable and replaceable, embedding mortality within the architecture of administration and ensuring that, compared to its parent camp, Gusen stood as a place where the arithmetic of exploitation yielded a higher and more relentless human cost. Chapter 4, Segment 3: Collapse, Overcrowding, and the Final Surge of Death. By the final year of the war, Gusen's lethal system, already calibrated to consume bodies through labor, entered a phase of accelerated collapse that pushed mortality beyond even its brutal norm, because as the Eastern Front crumbled and the SS evacuated camps ahead of the advancing Red Army, thousands of emaciated prisoners were forced westward and funneled into the Mauthausen-Gusen complex, overwhelming facilities that had never been designed to absorb such numbers. And in that sudden surge of humanity, starving, frostbitten, diseased, the thin structure that had maintained industrial discipline gave way to chaos disguised as order. Transports arrived packed with men who had survived ghettos, marches, and prior camps, many already at the brink of death, and yet instead of medical triage or relief they encountered barracks so overcrowded that bunks meant for two held 5 or 6 bodies. Corridors became sleeping spaces and sanitation systems, fragile even at lower capacity, failed under the strain, allowing lice and infection to spread unchecked through a population whose immune systems were already shattered. Food supplies dwindled as Germany's own resources shrank under Allied bombing and blockade, and what little reached the camp was diluted further. Thin soups stretched beyond nutritional value, bread rations sliced ever smaller, so that caloric intake dropped even as forced labor continued in tunnels and factories producing aircraft components and weapons deemed essential to a war already lost. The result was a catastrophic imbalance. Bodies demanded to work without fuel, lungs forced to inhale dust and chemical fumes without rest, and muscles ordered to lift and carry long after they had consumed their own reserves, turning the underground tunnels of Gusen II in particular into corridors of slow-motion collapse where men fainted at their stations and were dragged aside so production would not halt. Disease surged with renewed force, typhus and dysentery cutting through the ranks, and infirmaries, never intended for true healing, became holding spaces where those too weak to return to work awaited death, sometimes receiving injections under the guise of treatment, sometimes simply left unattended until their breathing stopped. As discipline frayed, punishments intensified. Guards, sensing the regime's impending defeat, oscillated between panic and cruelty, beating prisoners for minor infractions, conducting arbitrary executions, and driving work details harder in a futile attempt to fulfill quotas that no longer corresponded to military reality. Administrative records from these months reveal an eerie persistence of paperwork. lists of arrivals, transfers, and deaths continuing even as the structure they documented disintegrated, demonstrating how bureaucracy clung to form while the human cost spiraled beyond containment. Mortality rates soared not in a single dramatic spike but in an unrelenting climb, as weakened new arrivals succumbed within days and long-term prisoners, already skeletal from years of deprivation, finally reached the limits of endurance, their bodies unable to absorb another winter of hunger and cold. Cremation facilities struggled to keep pace, and mass graves expanded in fields near the camp, evidence of a system that had always anticipated attrition but was now drowning in its own arithmetic. The distinction between Mauthausen and Gusen blurred in these final weeks as prisoners were shuffled between sites, yet testimony consistently points to Gusen's sections, particularly the tunnel camps, as places where the convergence of overcrowding, starvation, and underground labor created a uniquely lethal environment, one in which survival depended less on resilience than on improbable luck, a skipped assignment, an unnoticed illness, a moment of solidarity that secured an extra crust of bread. Solidarity itself became harder to sustain under such strain. Networks that had once shared information and ration scraps found their numbers thinned, their organizers dead or incapacitated, yet fragments of resistance persisted even then, small acts of mutual protection that challenged the system's attempt to reduce each man to isolated exhaustion. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in and the SS contemplated evacuation, confusion reigned. Some guards fled, others debated further marches, and rumors of imminent liberation rippled through barracks where hope had long been suppressed by daily reality. But liberation did not erase the preceding months of intensified death. When American troops arrived at the broader complex in early May, they encountered not a functioning industrial camp but a landscape of collapse. Emaciated survivors lying beside the bodies of those who had not endured, workshops half abandoned, tunnels echoing with the residue of forced production. In retrospect, these final months crystallize why Gusen earned its reputation as deadlier than its parent camp. Not because it was conceived differently in ideology, but because its structural integration with underground industry, its chronic overcrowding, and the late-war influx of doomed transports combined to create a crescendo of mortality that surpassed earlier phases, demonstrating how a system built on exploitation could become most lethal when it began to fail. Gusen's last chapter was therefore not a sudden explosion of violence but the predictable outcome of years of calculated deprivation intensified by collapse. A grim confirmation that when human beings are treated as replaceable components within a war machine, the machine does not pause even as it destroys itself, and those trapped inside pay the final cost. Chapter 5, Segment 1, Industrial Slavery Beneath the Earth. If Gusen became deadlier than Mauthausen, it was because it did not simply imprison men above ground. It buried them beneath it, transforming mountains into factories and prisoners into expendable fuel for weapons production, and in doing so it fused concentration camp terror with the full machinery of modern industrial war. By 1943, as Allied bombing intensified over Germany, the Nazi leadership began relocating critical armaments production underground, believing that stone and earth could shield factories from destruction in the sky, and the granite hills around Gusen were selected as ideal terrain for this desperate strategy. Vast tunnel systems were blasted into the rock, first crude and unstable, then expanded into sprawling subterranean complexes where Messerschmitt aircraft components, fuselages, and later complete jet fighters were assembled in darkness thick with dust and chemical fumes. Prisoners were driven into these tunnels in shifts that erased any boundary between day and night, their sense of time dissolved by artificial light and relentless supervision, and unlike earlier quarry labor that at least exposed them to open air, the underground environment magnified every vulnerability. Oxygen grew thin, ventilation systems malfunctioned, and the echo of drills and detonations reverberated through lungs already weakened by malnutrition. Work quotas were calculated not according to human endurance but according to production deadlines dictated by Berlin, and foremen from private firms coordinated directly with SS overseers, ensuring that delays were answered with beatings or the transfer of exhausted men to even harsher details. This integration of civilian industry with camp authority meant that economic efficiency and brutality reinforced one another, creating a loop in which profit and punishment became indistinguishable. Mortality in the tunnels rose sharply, not always through overt execution but through cumulative collapse. Crushed limbs from falling stone, untreated infections from minor wounds that festered in filth, lungs scarred by inhaled particles, and starvation that hollowed out muscle until tools slipped from skeletal hands. Those who faltered were replaced by new arrivals from across occupied Europe, and the cycle repeated with mechanical indifference. The term Vernichtung durch Arbeit, destruction through labor, was not a slogan here but an observable pattern, measurable in the shrinking bodies of men who entered the tunnel complexes and the corpses carried out at shift's end, their names reduced to numbers in camp ledgers that recorded output alongside death counts. As production intensified, Gusen sections expanded into Gusen II and Gusen III, each linked by function yet distinct in layout, forming a constellation of subterranean workshops that operated as one organism dedicated to sustaining a war already turning against Germany. Above ground, barracks swelled with workers assigned to these sites, and overcrowding worsened as transports arrived from camps evacuated in the east, feeding the underground labor pool with men who were often too weak to survive even a single winter. Food rations failed to compensate for the energy demanded by this environment, and the imbalance manifested in swelling legs, collapsing immune systems, and fainting fits that triggered punishment rather than relief. Guards interpreted physical failure as defiance, reinforcing a climate where compassion was replaced by calculation. Industrial managers occasionally petitioned for slightly improved conditions, not from humanitarian concern but from fear that excessive mortality would undermine production. Yet such adjustments rarely translated into meaningful change, and the SS retained ultimate authority, ensuring that ideological contempt for prisoners overrode pragmatic efficiency whenever the two conflicted. In this subterranean world, identity dissolved. Political prisoners worked beside Jews, Soviet POWs beside resistance fighters, all bound by the same rhythm of extraction and assembly, and though language barriers separated them, shared suffering forged fragile networks of assistance. A whispered warning about a dangerous shaft, a fragment of bread passed discreetly, a moment of support that allowed a staggering man to finish a shift. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they punctured its attempt to reduce every individual to isolated labor power. By late 1944 and early 1945, as Germany's defeat became increasingly certain, production demands paradoxically intensified, a final surge of effort intended to reverse military collapse, and in this last phase the lethal nature of Gusen reached its apex. The tunnels consumed more lives than ever, crematoria strained, and mass graves expanded even as paperwork continued to classify deaths as routine attrition. The underground rocket and aircraft programs that symbolized technological ambition were thus sustained by an architecture of starvation and terror, revealing how modern engineering and primitive cruelty could coexist within a single project. When liberation finally approached, what remained beneath the hills were not only incomplete aircraft parts and abandoned machinery, but a record etched into stone. A testament that Gusen's deadliness was not incidental but structural, born from the decision to merge industrial ambition with a camp system designed to exhaust bodies to extinction, proving that in the depths of those tunnels, the boundary between factory and graveyard had disappeared entirely. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Mortality as a Metric. By the time Gusen reached its most expansive phase, death was no longer an unintended consequence of brutality. It had become an embedded feature of the camp's operational logic, measurable in statistics, visible in Baroque ledgers, and silently anticipated by those forced to live within its fences. Mortality rates at Gusen consistently surpassed those of Mauthausen, not because executions were always more frequent in spectacle, but because survival itself had been engineered into improbability. The combination of underground labor, chronic starvation, overcrowding, and systematic medical neglect produced a mathematical certainty that large numbers would not endure more than a few months. Prisoners assigned to the quarry in earlier years faced relentless physical strain, But as tunnel construction and aircraft production expanded, the demands intensified in both duration and toxicity, exposing men to silica dust, chemical solvents, unstable explosives, and extreme shifts in temperature that eroded immune systems already compromised by malnutrition. Rations, calculated to sustain minimal productivity, rarely matched caloric expenditure. Thin soups and scraps of bread were insufficient against 10 to 12 hours of heavy labor, and as weight dropped, muscle wasted, and strength diminished, a downward spiral began. Weakness reduced efficiency triggered punishment or transfer to harsher details, and harsher details accelerated physical collapse. Camp administrators documented deaths with bureaucratic precision, attributing them to pneumonia, heart failure, or general weakness, terms that obscured the underlying architecture of deprivation. In this way, mortality could be recorded without acknowledging intention, allowing paperwork to maintain an illusion of routine management. Transports arriving from other camps during evacuation phases further strained capacity, swelling Gusen's population beyond any sustainable threshold, and overcrowded barracks became incubators for disease, particularly dysentery and typhus, which spread rapidly in conditions where sanitation was nearly non-existent and medical supplies were reserved for those deemed temporarily valuable. The infirmary, or revier, offered little sanctuary. It functioned less as a place of healing and more as a holding zone where the gravely ill were sorted, sometimes selected for transport, sometimes left to die in rows of bunks that smelled of infection and despair. Mortality statistics from the final years reveal a grim pattern. As industrial output rose, so too did the number of recorded deaths, suggesting a direct relationship between production pressure and human expendability, a ratio in which each increment of machinery corresponded with a decrement in lives. Unlike camps whose primary function centered on immediate extermination, Gusen's lethality unfolded through accumulation. Small daily degradations compounded until the body simply ceased. The absence of dramatic spectacle made the process less visible but no less deliberate. Prisoners understood this arithmetic intimately. They counted not days but weeks survived, aware that the average lifespan for new arrivals could be frighteningly brief, and this knowledge shaped behavior, conserving energy where possible, sharing strategies for avoiding the most lethal assignments, forming quiet alliances that might extend endurance by a fraction. Yet even these survival tactics were fragile in a system designed to rotate laborers through increasingly punishing tasks, preventing any stable adaptation from taking root. As Germany's war situation deteriorated, the regime's insistence on maintaining output despite collapsing supply lines amplified chaos within the camp, and the resulting shortages intensified hunger while discipline remained uncompromising, creating an atmosphere where death seemed to hover just beyond sight, an inevitability rather than a possibility. In this environment, mortality was not merely the outcome of individual weakness. It was the predictable result of structural decisions to prioritize aircraft components over calories, to value tunnel expansion over ventilation, to treat human bodies as replaceable inputs rather than lives with limits. When liberation finally interrupted the machinery, investigators confronted not only skeletal survivors and rows of corpses, but also documentation that revealed how systematically the process had unfolded. Gusen's deadliness lay in this fusion of cruelty and calculation, where suffering was normalized through routine entries in ledgers, and where the erosion of thousands could proceed under the guise of administrative order. In the end, mortality at Gusen was not an accident of war. It was a metric sustained by policy, a silent column of numbers that testified to a system in which endurance itself had been rendered nearly impossible, and in which death functioned as the final confirmation that a prisoner's labor had been fully extracted. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Collapse Without Relief. As the war entered its final phase and the Reich began to fracture under relentless military pressure, one might expect that conditions inside Gusen would have eased, that chaos might have disrupted the routines of exploitation, or that oversight might have faltered enough to create openings for relief, but the opposite occurred. Collapse did not bring mercy. It intensified desperation, and desperation made the camp even more lethal. By late 1944 and early 1945, transports from evacuated camps in the east flooded into the Mauthausen complex, and Gusen absorbed thousands of additional prisoners at a moment when its infrastructure was already stretched beyond capacity. Bunks meant for two held 5 or 6, straw mattresses rotted into dust, and men slept pressed against one another in suffocating air heavy with sickness and fear. Food rations shrank further as supply chains broke down, yet production quotas for underground aircraft assembly and tunnel excavation remained rigid, enforced by guards who understood that failure would invite punishment from their superiors. Thus, the logic of extraction intensified precisely when the bodies available for extraction were weakest. The tunnels, damp and poorly ventilated, became environments of near-permanent darkness, where artificial light flickered over hollow faces and the echo of machinery blended with coughing that would not stop. Many prisoners no longer possessed the strength to carry tools, yet they were driven forward, stumbling along rails that guided components through cavernous corridors carved into the mountain. Disease spread unchecked. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and typhus thrived in overcrowded barracks, and the infirmary overflowed with men too ill to stand. Yet selections and forced labor details continued, blurring the line between the sick and the condemned. Executions, both formal and arbitrary, increased in frequency as discipline tightened. Minor infractions, suspected sabotage, or simple exhaustion could result in immediate violence, and the message was unmistakable. The camp would operate until the last possible hour, regardless of the human toll. Rumors of approaching Allied forces circulated in whispers, carried through the network of prisoner communication that had evolved quietly over years, but hope was cautious, fragile, almost dangerous. Men had learned not to trust distant sounds of artillery or sudden changes in guard behavior, because false hope could drain the little strength required to endure another day. Meanwhile, administrators continued to record transfers, deaths, and work assignments with bureaucratic detachment, as though paperwork itself might stabilize a system already unraveling. This illusion of order masked the growing panic among the SS, who began planning evacuations even as they sought to conceal evidence of the camp's scale. Death marches were prepared, routes mapped across frozen roads, prisoners forced into columns despite visible weakness. Those unable to keep pace risked being shot or abandoned in ditches along the way, transforming the surrounding countryside into an extension of the camp's lethality. Within Gusen, starvation reached such levels that some men collapsed before roll call had ended, and bodies sometimes lay unattended for hours because labor details could not be interrupted. The normalization of death had advanced to a point where even the presence of corpses failed to disrupt routine. Yet within this atmosphere of extreme deprivation, acts of solidarity persisted. A crust of bread shared, a whispered warning about an inspection, a place in line traded to spare someone a harsher assignment. Gestures small in scale but immense in moral resistance. As Allied forces drew closer in May 1945, the SS began to abandon positions, some fleeing, others attempting to destroy records, but the physical evidence of years of exploitation could not be erased. Tunnels filled with half-assembled aircraft parts, barracks crowded with skeletal figures, mass graves hidden too shallowly to escape discovery. When liberation finally arrived, it did not unfold as a triumphant scene of immediate relief. It revealed a population on the brink of extinction, thousands too weak to celebrate, many dying in the days that followed because their bodies could no longer sustain sudden changes in diet or environment. Gusen's final weeks demonstrated the ultimate truth of its design, that it was never dependent on stability to function. Even as the Reich disintegrated, the camp's core principle remained intact, extracting labor until exhaustion ended usefulness and allowing mortality to rise unchecked. Collapse, in this context, was not a rupture but a culmination, the final stage of a system that had always measured value in output and tolerated death as routine. And in those last days, as guards fled and gates opened, the full weight of that routine became visible, not as isolated acts of cruelty, but as the predictable outcome of years in which work had been transformed into a weapon and survival, had been reduced to an exception rather than a rule. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The expansion into Gusen II and III. By the time Gusen I had already established itself as one of the harshest and most lethal labor sites within the Mauthausen complex, the logic driving its existence had only intensified. The war demanded more weapons, more aircraft, more stone, more output, and the SS understood that if human life could be consumed as fuel, then expansion was not just possible, it was profitable. Thus began the creation of Gusen II and later Gusen III, not as independent camps in spirit, but as extensions of the same brutal philosophy that had defined the original site. What started as a quarry-based system evolved into a vast industrial labor network, increasingly hidden underground as Allied bombing campaigns threatened surface factories across the Reich. The solution was to move production beneath mountains, and to use prisoners to carve those mountains open. Gusen II emerged in 1944 as a direct response to the urgent demand for underground aircraft production, particularly components for advanced fighter planes meant to defend German skies. Prisoners were transferred in large numbers, many already weakened from previous camps, and forced into the excavation of massive tunnel systems through solid rock, creating cavernous halls that would later house assembly lines for Messerschmitt aircraft parts. These tunnels were not temporary shelters. They were engineered industrial spaces, but their construction required backbreaking labor under constant surveillance, in suffocating air thick with dust and explosives. Men worked in shifts that blurred into one another, deprived of natural light, their sense of time dissolving into a continuous rhythm of drilling, hauling, and collapsing from exhaustion. Gusen III, smaller but no less severe, functioned as an auxiliary extension designed to absorb overflow and sustain specialized production demands, particularly as evacuation transports from other camps poured into the region. The expansion did not reflect administrative stability, it reflected desperation. The SS leadership recognized that as the war turned against Germany, production had to accelerate, even if the workforce was visibly deteriorating. Mortality rates climbed sharply during this period, not only because labor demands increased, but because rations shrank, medical care remained non-existent, and overcrowding reached catastrophic levels. Barracks built for hundreds now held thousands. Sanitation collapsed. Typhus and dysentery spread through the population with terrifying speed, often unchecked for weeks before any minimal containment efforts were attempted. Yet, despite these conditions, the bureaucratic structure remained intact. Records were kept. Work quotas were calculated. Supervisors filed reports detailing output and losses as though human beings were interchangeable components in the machinery of war. The cruelty of Gusen II and III lay not in chaos but in order, a systematic scaling of exploitation where death was anticipated as a natural byproduct of production. The underground facilities became symbols of this transformation. Once envisioned as protective sanctuaries for industrial survival, they became sealed environments of relentless suffering, where the air grew stale and the walls seemed to close in on men who had not seen sunlight for days. Prisoners were driven from surface barracks to tunnel entrances in the early hours before dawn, returning long after dark, their bodies coated in dust, their lungs damaged by constant inhalation of debris. Collapses inside the tunnels were common, and when cave-ins occurred, rescue efforts were minimal. If trapped men could not be reached quickly, they were often abandoned to conserve time and manpower. Guards enforced discipline with beatings and threats, reinforcing the idea that productivity outweighed all other considerations. And yet, even in this expanding web of exploitation, moments of human solidarity endured. Prisoners from different nationalities, Poles, French, Italians, Soviets, Spaniards, Jews from across Europe, formed quiet alliances, sharing tools, warning one another of inspections, attempting to redistribute scarce food. These fragile networks did not dismantle the system, but they disrupted its assumption that isolation would eliminate resistance. As Gusen II and III expanded, so too did the scale of suffering, but the essential formula remained unchanged. Labor until exhaustion, replacement upon collapse, and continuation without pause. By late 1944 and early 1945, the combined Gusen camps had become a massive, integrated labor complex feeding directly into the German war machine, operating under conditions so severe that survival itself became statistically unlikely. The expansion did not dilute the brutality of Gusen I, it multiplied it, embedding the principle of annihilation through labor deeper into the structure of the camp network. And in doing so, Gusen II and III transformed what had already been one of the deadliest environments in the Nazi system into something even more expansive and lethal. A sprawling underground world where production echoed through stone corridors, and where the cost of every aircraft component was measured not only in steel and fuel, but in the lives consumed to build it. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Collapse beneath the mountains. As Gusen II and III expanded deeper into the rock, the physical structure of the camp system began to mirror the moral collapse of the regime that sustained it, and by late 1944 the underground factories were no longer symbols of industrial ingenuity but chambers of suffocation where exhaustion accumulated faster than production could compensate for it. The tunnels, originally blasted to protect aircraft manufacturing from Allied bombs, became sealed corridors of heat, dust, and relentless noise, their walls sweating moisture while electric cables and rail tracks snaked through darkness that never truly lifted. Prisoners were forced to work in rotating shifts that effectively erased the boundary between day and night, and because the majority of them were already weakened by months or years of starvation, the demands placed upon their bodies accelerated deterioration at a pace even the SS had come to expect. Rations continued to shrink as supply lines fractured across collapsing German territory, and the thin soup distributed in metal containers no longer sustained even minimal caloric needs. Men fainted mid-task, dropped tools, or simply leaned against tunnel walls until guards noticed and responded with blows. The air itself became an adversary, thick with powdered granite and residue from explosives, inhaled hour after hour until lungs burned and coughed blood. Tuberculosis spread quietly in these enclosed spaces, thriving in damp conditions where ventilation systems were insufficient for the scale of labor being conducted. Typhus outbreaks compounded the devastation in overcrowded barracks above ground, where straw bedding rotted and lice moved freely from one skeletal body to another. Yet even as disease tore through the population, production quotas did not decline proportionally. Engineers and overseers recorded target numbers for aircraft fuselage parts and rocket components, maintaining the bureaucratic fiction that output could remain steady despite a workforce visibly collapsing. This contradiction defined the final operational phase of Gusen. The camp was at once indispensable to the war economy and structurally unsustainable. The SS administration attempted to stabilize the situation by transferring in new transports from camps further east as the front lines shifted. But these arrivals were often men who had survived evacuation marches under brutal winter conditions, arriving frostbitten, dehydrated, and scarcely able to stand. Instead of relief, their arrival intensified overcrowding and further strained resources. The mortality rate rose sharply, bodies accumulating faster than crematoria could process them, leading to temporary burial pits that were later reopened as conditions worsened. Discipline grew harsher, not because the SS believed stricter punishment would restore efficiency, but because violence had become reflexive, a tool used to mask the evident failure of the system. Executions for minor infractions increased, and public hangings were staged to reassert control over a population too weak to mount open resistance but still capable of quiet defiance. Inside the tunnels, however, subtle forms of sabotage began to appear. Tools misplaced, measurements slightly altered, parts assembled with imperceptible flaws that might compromise performance without immediate detection. These acts were dangerous and rare, but they reflected a psychological shift. Even in near-total physical exhaustion, the will to undermine the machinery of exploitation survived. The underground complex, meant to guarantee Germany's technological resilience, instead exposed the fragility of a regime that depended entirely on coercion. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced from multiple directions, rumors filtered through the camp that the war was nearing its end. But these whispers brought not immediate relief, only intensified anxiety. Guards debated evacuation plans. Administrative staff hurried to reorganize records. Some tunnel areas were partially dismantled in attempts to obscure evidence of production and forced labor conditions. Yet the sheer scale of the underground infrastructure made total erasure impossible. Meanwhile, prisoners faced an agonizing uncertainty. Would they be forced onto death marches, abandoned, or executed to eliminate witnesses? In the barracks, men who had survived years of calculated deprivation found themselves confronting the possibility of final annihilation at the very edge of liberation. The paradox of Gusen's collapse lay in its persistence. Even as Germany's military capacity disintegrated, the camp continued to function, grinding forward through habit and fear rather than strategic necessity. The tunnels remained operational until the final weeks, their assembly lines still producing fragments of a war already lost. And within those rock walls, beneath layers of granite carved by starving hands, the full contradiction of Gusen was revealed. It had been expanded to preserve a crumbling empire, but in doing so it consumed its labor force so completely that the system began to hollow itself out from within. By the spring of 1945, what remained was not a model of industrial strength but a subterranean testament to exhaustion. A vast network of corridors echoing with machines, where the cost of every hour of production was measured in the thinning breath of men who knew the regime was falling, yet were forced to keep working as though it could still be saved. Chapter 6, Segment 3, The Final Weeks in the Tunnels. By the time the spring of 1945 approached, Gusen had entered its most chaotic and lethal phase, not because the machinery had stopped, but because it refused to stop even as the Reich itself was collapsing. Inside the tunnels, the rhythm of forced labor continued with mechanical indifference. Electric lamps flickered against raw stone walls, illuminating conveyor tracks and half-assembled aircraft parts, while men whose bodies had already been hollowed by starvation struggled to remain upright. Production no longer carried strategic meaning. It had become momentum without purpose, a system too entrenched in routine to acknowledge defeat. The SS officers overseeing the complex received fragmented reports of Allied advances and the encirclement of German cities, yet orders from above remained consistent. Maintain output, maintain discipline, maintain secrecy. In practice, this translated into longer hours, harsher punishments, and frantic attempts to reorganize what could not be saved. Barracks above ground swelled with new transports evacuated from other camps, many of them survivors of brutal winter marches who arrived with frostbitten feet, infected wounds, and the haunted expressions of men who had already watched thousands die. The overcrowding pushed sanitation beyond collapse. Latrines overflowed. Clean water became scarce. Typhus and dysentery spread through rooms so tightly packed that prisoners slept on their sides, unable to turn without disturbing others. The crematoria could no longer process the dead at the rate required. Bodies were stacked in corners of the camp, covered loosely with cloth or left exposed to the cold air, awaiting disposal that might never come. In the tunnels, the air grew heavier as ventilation systems faltered under overuse and neglect. Dust hung in the beams of light, settling into lungs already damaged by months of quarry work and underground blasting. Men coughed blood into their sleeves, then returned to assembly tables because collapse meant immediate beating or execution. Guards, increasingly aware that the war was lost, displayed a volatile mixture of fear and cruelty. Some drank heavily. Others tightened their grip on authority, staging public punishments to assert control over a situation spiraling beyond their power. Executions multiplied, often justified under accusations of sabotage or disobedience, though the line between weakness and resistance had become indistinguishable. Amid this breakdown, quiet acts of defiance persisted. Prisoners whispered news gathered from newly arrived transports. Some deliberately slowed production, filing edges too thin or tightening bolts imperfectly. These gestures rarely halted output, but they represented a fragile assertion of agency within a system designed to erase individuality. Meanwhile, administrative staff attempted to destroy records, burning documents and rearranging files in hopes of obscuring the scale of exploitation conducted beneath the mountain. Equipment was dismantled in selected sections of the tunnel network, yet the vast infrastructure made comprehensive erasure impossible. Rumors spread that evacuations were imminent. The memory of earlier death marches haunted the barracks. Men knew that being forced out on foot in their condition meant near certain death. Each morning roll call carried the dread that orders might be read assigning them to columns bound for unknown destinations. And yet, paradoxically, work continued underground, as though the act of production could delay the reckoning approaching from every direction. By late April, the soundscape of Gusen shifted. Distant artillery thunder replaced the usual mechanical hum. Guards debated openly among themselves. Some fled. Others remained, uncertain whether surrender would bring retribution. Inside the tunnels, prisoners felt the tremor of change before they saw it. Production lines slowed not by command but by attrition. Too many workers were too weak to maintain pace. The final days blurred into a strange suspension of time, fear and anticipation interwoven. When liberation finally came, it did not arrive as a dramatic interruption inside the tunnels but as a gradual realization above ground. The guards were gone, the gates unguarded. The regime that had enforced the routine of suffering had vanished almost overnight. Allied troops encountered not a functioning industrial site, but a devastated landscape of emaciated survivors, stacked bodies, and vast underground chambers that testified to the scale of forced labor concealed beneath Austrian soil. For those who had endured Gusen's depths, freedom did not erase the memory of stone dust in their lungs or the echo of machinery that had consumed years of their lives. The tunnels remained, silent now, carved into the mountain as enduring evidence that the camp had not simply been an extension of Mauthausen, but a lethal organism of its own. One that persisted until the very last breath of the collapsing Reich, grinding forward in darkness while the world outside was already changing. Chapter 7, Segment 1, Liberation and the Evidence Beneath the Mountain. When liberation reached the Mauthausen-Gusen complex in early May 1945, it did not unfold as a single dramatic moment but as a gradual collapse of authority that exposed, layer by layer, what had been hidden beneath stone and bureaucracy. By the time American forces advanced into the region, many SS personnel had already fled, abandoning posts that only days earlier had enforced absolute control. The perimeter fences still stood. Watchtowers still cast long shadows. But the structure of fear that had governed daily life was suddenly hollow. Inside Gusen, prisoners emerged from barracks in disbelief, unsure whether the absence of guards signaled a trap or genuine abandonment. For years, every movement had been regulated by whistles, roll calls, and punishment details. Now there was silence, and in that silence, uncertainty. When Allied soldiers entered the camp area and the tunnel installations connected to it, they encountered not simply survivors but evidence. Thousands of men lay in bunks reduced to skeletal forms, their uniforms hanging like fabric draped over bone. Many were too weak to stand. Others attempted to greet the liberators, only to collapse from exhaustion. Medical units were unprepared for the scale of starvation, disease, and psychological trauma concentrated within the camp. Typhus raged through overcrowded barracks. Lice infestation was universal. Improvised infirmaries had been overwhelmed long before liberation. Now military doctors faced the challenge of preventing further deaths among men whose bodies could not withstand sudden nourishment or shock. Refeeding had to be controlled carefully. Clean water had to be secured. Burial details were organized, not as acts of punishment, but as necessary steps to restore sanitation and dignity. Yet beyond the human crisis lay the physical infrastructure that stunned observers. The underground tunnels of Gusen vast, engineered caverns carved deep into the hillside, revealed a level of industrial exploitation that contradicted any notion that the camp had been merely a detention site. Assembly lines, electrical systems, ventilation shafts, storage chambers, and rail tracks demonstrated how forced labor had been integrated into the Nazi war economy with meticulous planning. These were not improvised spaces. They were engineered facilities built with the expectation of long-term production. Allied officers documented everything. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, machinery cataloged. Surviving records, partially burned or hastily abandoned, were gathered as potential evidence for future war crimes trials. The scale of what Gusen represented, a camp where tens of thousands had died not in gas chambers alone, but through calculated labor exhaustion, began to crystallize in official reports. Local civilians, some of whom claimed ignorance of the camp's inner workings, were confronted with its reality. In certain instances, they were required to assist in burying the dead, an act intended to ensure that what had occurred could not be dismissed as rumor. For survivors, liberation brought complex emotions. Relief mixed with grief. Freedom arrived alongside the realization that families had vanished, that homes across Europe had been destroyed, that return might be impossible. Some prisoners immediately searched for friends within the sprawling complex, calling out names in barracks and tunnel entrances. Others sat quietly, unable to process the abrupt transition from total control to sudden autonomy. The psychological adjustment was immense. Years of regimented survival had conditioned them to anticipate violence at any moment. Now they faced decisions whether to remain, to seek medical evacuation, to begin the long journey home. As medical teams stabilized the living, investigative units focused increasingly on accountability. Testimonies were gathered from survivors who described quarry labor, tunnel construction, starvation rations, beatings, executions, and the deliberate intensification of work quotas even as death rates soared. These statements would later contribute to trials aimed at prosecuting those responsible. Yet even in those early days, it was evident that not every perpetrator would be captured, not every record recovered. Many SS officials had escaped or blended into retreating military columns. The camp's administrative structure had been partially dismantled, leaving gaps in documentation. Still, the tunnels remained undeniable. They could not be erased quickly. Their scale contradicted claims that abuses had been isolated or unintended. Gusen's infrastructure testified to systemic exploitation. In the weeks following liberation, the camp transformed into a site of emergency recovery. Medical tents replaced guard posts. Allied flags flew above barbed wire that once symbolized imprisonment. Gradually, as survivors were transferred to hospitals or displaced persons camps, the immediate crisis receded. But the question lingered: what would become of the physical space itself? The quarries, the barracks, the underground factories. These were not only remnants of suffering, but material proof of how modern industry and totalitarian ideology had converged. Chapter 7 begins here, in the aftermath, when silence settled over the tunnels and the world confronted what had been concealed beneath the mountain. Not just a camp, but a lethal system sustained by labor, secrecy, and relentless administrative precision until the final collapse of the Reich. Chapter 7, Segment 2, Trials, Testimony, and the Struggle for Justice. In the months following liberation, as survivors of Gusen and the wider Mauthausen complex began the slow and fragile process of recovery, another process unfolded in parallel: the effort to transform memory into legal accountability. The physical evidence gathered by Allied forces was only the beginning. Barracks, tunnels, crematoria, and administrative offices demonstrated the existence of the system, but courts required names, chains of command, documented responsibility. Investigators moved through archives, interviewing former prisoners, interrogating captured SS personnel, and assembling a framework that could connect individual acts of cruelty to institutional authority. It quickly became clear that Gusen had not been an isolated anomaly within the camp network. Orders flowed downward from SS leadership structures, filtered through commandants, adjutants, and block leaders, and manifested in daily quotas, punishment details, and labor assignments that drove mortality rates to staggering levels. The Mauthausen trials, conducted by American military tribunals beginning in 1946, sought to address crimes committed across the camp system, including Gusen. Former guards, administrative staff, and officials were charged with participation in a program of persecution and murder. Survivors stepped forward to testify, recounting starvation rations, beatings in the quarry, the relentless pace of tunnel construction, and executions carried out under bureaucratic pretext. For many, speaking publicly about what they had endured required immense emotional endurance. Years of survival had depended on silence and restraint. Now they were asked to reconstruct horror in precise detail before judges and prosecutors. The courtroom became a space where memory confronted denial. Some defendants claimed ignorance, insisting they had followed orders without knowledge of the broader system. Others attempted to minimize their roles, describing themselves as minor functionaries within a vast apparatus. Yet documentation revealed patterns, identical labor policies, coordinated transportation records, centralized oversight of production contracts. Industrial firms that had benefited from forced labor entered the narrative as well, raising complex questions about corporate complicity and the blurred boundary between civilian industry and SS administration. While not all industrial actors faced prosecution at the same level as camp personnel, the trials exposed the integration of economic ambition with camp exploitation. Verdicts varied. Some defendants received death sentences. Others were imprisoned for years. A number were acquitted due to insufficient direct evidence linking them to specific acts. For survivors, the outcomes brought mixed reactions. Justice, though pursued, could never equate to restoration. No sentence could revive those who had perished in the quarries or suffocated in the tunnels. Still, the trials established a historical record that countered attempts to dismiss the camps as wartime excesses or isolated brutality. Testimony entered transcripts. Photographs were catalogued. Architectural diagrams of the underground facilities were introduced as exhibits. Gusen's lethality became part of the documented narrative of Nazi crimes. Yet even as courts operated, broader geopolitical shifts complicated the pursuit of accountability. The emerging Cold War reshaped priorities across Europe. In some cases, former SS members were released earlier than anticipated or reintegrated into post-war society. Investigations slowed as political focus shifted toward new tensions between East and West. The memory of Gusen risked being overshadowed by the accelerating divisions of the post-war world. Survivors dispersed across continents, to displaced persons camps, to Israel, to North and South America, to rebuilt communities in Europe. Each carried personal testimony that would sustain remembrance even when official attention waned. For decades, former prisoners returned to the site to commemorate those who had died, organizing memorial ceremonies in spaces that had once been guarded by armed sentries. Their presence transformed the terrain from a location of forced labor into a landscape of witness. Oral histories were recorded, archives expanded, and scholars gradually examined the specific dynamics that had made Gusen particularly lethal within the broader Mauthausen system. Mortality statistics were analyzed, comparing Gusen's rates to those of its parent camp. Researchers highlighted the combination of quarry labor, underground construction, inadequate rations, and deliberate brutality that produced death on such scale. Over time, The trials came to be understood not merely as punitive measures but as foundational acts in the construction of historical memory. They affirmed that Gusen's suffering was not accidental, not chaotic, but structured and directed. Even so, the struggle for justice extended beyond courtrooms. Survivors advocated for recognition, for educational programs, for preservation of remaining structures. Portions of the camp area had been dismantled or repurposed in the immediate post-war years, complicating efforts to maintain a coherent memorial landscape. The tunnels, massive and enduring, remained a stark reminder of what had been built through coercion. Chapter 7's second movement rests within this intersection of law, memory, and the limits of accountability. Liberation ended the machinery of forced labor, but it did not automatically resolve the moral and legal reckoning that followed. The trials marked an attempt to translate suffering into testimony and testimony into record, an effort to ensure that the lethal calculus of Gusen would not dissolve into abstraction, but remain anchored in documented truth for generations that would inherit its history. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Memory, Silence, and the Weight of the Landscape. In the decades after the war, as Europe rebuilt its cities and redefined its borders, the ground at Gusen remained heavy with a different kind of reconstruction. The reconstruction of memory, fragile, contested, and often incomplete. Unlike some camps that were preserved immediately as major memorial sites, large portions of the Gusen complex were gradually absorbed back into civilian life. Houses were built near former barracks. Roads crossed ground once lined with barbed wire. In some areas, everyday routines resumed above soil that still held unmarked graves. The transformation was not malicious in every case. Post-war communities faced housing shortages, economic strain, and the urgent need to move forward. Yet the effect was a layering of normalcy over a place where mortality had once been engineered with precision. For survivors returning years later, the dissonance could be overwhelming. The quarry still stood. The tunnels remained carved into the hillside. But the visible framework of imprisonment had been altered, dismantled, or obscured. Memory, then, depended less on intact architecture and more on testimony, on the willingness of witnesses to speak and the readiness of societies to listen. Survivor associations played a central role in preserving the history of Gusen. Former prisoners gathered annually, not only to mourn but to insist that the camp's lethality be recognized distinctly within the broader Mauthausen system. They described how Gusen's labor quotas were harsher, how rations were thinner, how the underground expansion intensified already lethal conditions. Through oral histories, diaries, and recorded interviews, they reconstructed daily life inside the camp, the early roll calls in freezing air, the slow march toward the quarry, the claustrophobic shifts inside damp tunnels, the collapse of men who had no strength left to lift a tool. Scholars gradually engaged with these accounts, analyzing mortality rates and administrative documents to trace the factors that made Gusen deadlier than its parent camp. Research revealed how economic demands for stone and later aircraft components translated directly into labor intensification. Industrial contracts were not abstract agreements. They shaped how long prisoners worked, how little they were fed, and how swiftly they were replaced when they could no longer perform. This integration of industry and incarceration became central to understanding Gusen's distinct profile within the camp network. Yet public awareness developed unevenly. In some regions, the name Gusen remained overshadowed by Mauthausen, its identity folded into the larger narrative. Survivors often emphasized the importance of specificity, not to compete in suffering, but to clarify historical truth. They argued that understanding Gusen's particular brutality illuminated how adaptable the camp system had been, how it could intensify exploitation wherever industrial opportunity aligned with ideological cruelty. Over time, memorial initiatives expanded. Monuments were erected. Educational programs introduced younger generations to the history embedded in the landscape. The remaining tunnel complexes, vast and echoing, became sites of guided reflection rather than forced labor. Standing within them, visitors confronted the scale of excavation achieved under coercion. Walls still bearing marks of tools wielded by men who labored without hope of reward. The silence inside these spaces carried weight. It was not empty silence, but layered silence. The absence of commands, the absence of footsteps under guard, replaced by the quiet presence of memory. Chapter 7 concludes not with a dramatic resolution, but with this enduring tension between forgetting and remembrance. Gusen's lethality cannot be measured solely by statistics, though the numbers are stark. It is measured also by the effort required to keep its history visible in landscapes that prefer to appear ordinary. The camp's legacy persists in archives, in testimony, in the preserved fragments of stone and tunnel that resist erasure. And in that persistence lies a final lesson. Systems built to dehumanize can be dismantled, but their traces remain. The responsibility to interpret those traces, carefully, honestly, and without distortion, passes from survivors to historians, from historians to educators, and from educators to all who stand where forced labor once turned breath into dust. Chapter 8, Segment 1, The Final Phase, Collapse, Overcrowding, and the Flood of Transports. By late 1944, as the Eastern Front fractured and Soviet forces advanced steadily westward, Gusen entered its most chaotic and lethal phase, a period defined not only by brutality but by uncontrolled overcrowding that transformed an already deadly labor camp into a site of accelerated collapse. Transports began arriving from evacuated camps farther east. Men driven out of places like Auschwitz, Grossrosen, and other satellite sites as the SS attempted to empty territories before liberation, and these prisoners were not arriving to functioning barracks with space or supplies, but to a system already strained beyond capacity, a complex where food was scarce, sanitation fragile, and labor quotas still relentless despite the crumbling military situation of the Reich. The infrastructure at Gusen had been built for exploitation, not humanitarian management, and as numbers swelled, the fragile balance between production demands and basic survival disintegrated entirely. Bunks designed for 2 men held 4 or 5, straw pallets rotted and crawled with lice, latrines overflowed, and the thin soup that passed for nourishment became even more diluted, stretched to cover new arrivals who were themselves already starved from forced marches. Disease followed predictably. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread through crowded rooms where windows were broken and winter air cut through weakened bodies. Yet work did not pause, because underground, factories still required labor to assemble aircraft components and maintain tunnel expansion, and SS officers, even in the war's final months, measured success not by human survival but by output quotas. The tunnels themselves became even more suffocating during this period, as ventilation systems faltered under expanded use and power disruptions grew more frequent, leaving prisoners laboring in dim light, breathing dust and exhaust in confined galleries that seemed to extend endlessly into rock. Those who collapsed were rarely given medical attention beyond cursory inspection, and the infirmary, never designed for large-scale treatment, overflowed with men who lay side by side on bare boards, feverish and skeletal, waiting either for recovery that seldom came or for transfer to spaces where death would be quieter. Executions increased as discipline tightened, because the SS feared disorder, desertion, and uprising amid the chaos, and punishments served as warnings that even as the regime faltered, internal control would not be surrendered. The paradox of this phase was stark. The German war machine was visibly weakening, cities were being bombed, fuel was scarce, communications disrupted, yet within Gusen the rhythm of forced labor continued with mechanical rigidity, as if the camp existed in a sealed sphere immune to political reality. Mortality rates surged sharply, not from a single policy change but from cumulative breakdown. Too many bodies, too little food, too much work, too little rest, and the replacement logic of earlier years now accelerated, because evacuated prisoners simply filled the gaps left by the dead. creating a cycle where the influx of transports masked the scale of ongoing losses. Survivors later described this period as one in which hope flickered but never stabilized. Rumors of approaching Allied forces circulated through whispers in barracks, yet no immediate relief followed, and each dawn brought the same whistle, the same roll call in cold wind, the same march toward quarries or tunnels. Guards themselves sensed the shifting tide of war, and some grew more erratic, enforcing rules with nervous aggression, while others focused solely on preserving documentation or destroying sensitive materials related to industrial contracts and labor statistics. Yet unlike extermination centers built primarily for concealment, Gusen's vast tunnels and quarry pits could not simply be erased. They were carved too deeply into the landscape, too expansive to dynamite entirely, and so the final months became less about systematic cover-up and more about frantic management of collapse. The camp's administrative offices attempted to maintain lists and transfers, but paper trails grew inconsistent as transport schedules changed abruptly and communications faltered, illustrating how even bureaucratic control, the backbone of the camp system, was beginning to fray. Still, for prisoners on the ground, these structural cracks did not translate into immediate relief. Instead, they experienced an intensification of deprivation, as resources diverted to the front left rations thinner and medical supplies scarcer. This was the final lethal transformation of Gusen. Not a sudden policy of mass execution, but a convergence of exhaustion, starvation, overcrowding, and institutional rigidity that allowed death to multiply even as the war approached its end. In this stage, Gusen demonstrated how a system built for exploitation does not require explicit new orders to become deadlier. It requires only continued operation under collapsing conditions and the refusal to prioritize human life over production. And as spring 1945 approached, the camp stood swollen, unstable, and saturated with suffering, a complex where the machinery of forced labor still turned, even as the Reich that demanded its output was visibly disintegrating beyond the barbed wire. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Death without orders, starvation, disease, and the machinery unchecked. As the front lines crept closer and the distant sound of artillery began to echo faintly across Upper Austria, Gusen did not descend into sudden chaos, but into something far more revealing. A continuation of routine under conditions that guaranteed mass death, because by early 1945 the camp no longer required new directives to kill. Starvation had become structural, disease had become ambient, and exhaustion had become irreversible. And within this environment mortality rose. Not because of spectacular acts of violence, but because every element necessary for survival had quietly collapsed. Food deliveries, already insufficient, grew irregular as rail lines were disrupted, yet labor quotas remained fixed, meaning men were expected to perform the same crushing tasks inside tunnels and quarries while receiving fewer calories than ever before, their bodies reduced to angular frames barely capable of standing through roll call. Typhus spread with ruthless efficiency. Through overcrowded barracks where lice thrived in unwashed clothing and bedding, and isolation measures were minimal, partly due to indifference, partly due to lack of space, and partly because the camp administration prioritized production above containment. The infirmary transformed into a holding space for the dying rather than a site of treatment, with medical orderlies overwhelmed, supplies exhausted, and decisions made swiftly about who might return to work and who would simply be left to fade. Witnesses later described rows of men too weak to lift their heads, the smell of sickness mingling with dust from the tunnels, and the growing normalization of death as a daily presence rather than an event. Executions continued, but increasingly they blended into the broader pattern of attrition. Men shot for attempting to secure extra food, beaten for faltering during marches between sections of the camp, or left exposed to cold after punishment. Yet these acts were now almost secondary to the overwhelming lethality of deprivation itself. Inside the underground factories, ventilation faltered more frequently as maintenance crews thinned and power disruptions increased, and prisoners labored in stale air thick with soot and moisture, assembling aircraft components for a regime that was losing control of its own skies. the paradox sharpened. Production demands persisted even as Allied bombing intensified and the strategic value of output diminished, revealing that the camp's internal logic had become autonomous, a system continuing out of momentum rather than rational calculation. SS personnel, aware of impending defeat, focused increasingly on preserving order, not necessarily to win the war, but to prevent rebellion and maintain personal authority, and so discipline grew harsher in small, everyday ways. Inspections lengthened, punishments quickened, surveillance tightened, reinforcing the illusion that control still existed. Meanwhile, the influx of prisoners from other collapsing camps added to the silent catastrophe, because each transport brought men already emaciated, already ill, and their arrival accelerated the spread of disease and the strain on food reserves, creating a feedback loop in which overcrowding amplified starvation and starvation weakened resistance to infection. The mortality curve steepened dramatically in these months, yet there was no single directive declaring extermination, no centralized plan announced for final liquidation. Instead, there was the grim persistence of a labor camp operating under terminal conditions, and that persistence proved lethal enough. Rumors circulated among prisoners about imminent liberation, whispered through tunnels and barracks at night, and hope flickered cautiously. But hope did not restore muscle, did not heal fever, did not fill stomachs, and so men continued to die in numbers that blurred individuality into statistics. Guards themselves displayed signs of strain, some preparing escape routes, others destroying documents, but few abandoning their posts entirely, because institutional culture and fear of accountability bound them to routine. This stage of Gusen's history exposes a critical truth about the camp system. Its deadliness was not solely dependent on active massacres, but on the maintenance of a structure that removed all margins of survival, a structure that, once destabilized by war, became even more indiscriminate. In these final weeks, death required no dramatic spectacle. It required only the continuation of labor under conditions where bodies could no longer sustain it. And as spring advanced, the camp resembled less an organized industrial site and more a landscape of systemic collapse. Yet the whistles still blew at dawn, roll calls still assembled skeletal lines of men, and the tunnels still demanded hands that no longer had strength. Gusen in early 1945 stood as a grim testament to how a regime could be visibly failing on the battlefield while its internal machinery of exploitation continued to function with lethal inertia, producing not victory, not strategic advantage, but only exhaustion, disease, and an expanding tally of the dead. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Liberation Approaches, Collapse, Panic, and the End of Control. By late April 1945, the illusion of permanence that had defined Gusen for years began to fracture visibly, not in a single dramatic rupture, but through subtle shifts in behavior, in tone, in routine, as whispers of approaching American forces filtered through barracks and tunnels, carried by new arrivals, by clandestine radios, by fragments of rumor that felt almost too fragile to believe. Yet the SS administration, outwardly rigid, had already begun its quiet preparations for disappearance, burning documents, dismantling equipment, relocating files, and debating whether to evacuate prisoners deeper into the collapsing Reich or abandon them where they stood. And within this uncertainty, the camp entered one of its most volatile phases, because a system built on strict hierarchy struggles when hierarchy begins to crumble. Guards who had once projected unchallenged authority now watched the horizon, calculating escape routes, some donning civilian clothing beneath uniforms, others transferring responsibility downward to subordinate functionaries, and prisoners sensed the shift immediately, recognizing that fear had changed direction, that for the first time their captors were not entirely certain of tomorrow. Yet this did not translate into immediate safety, because desperation often intensifies brutality, and in the days preceding liberation, executions continued, particularly against those suspected of organizing resistance or gathering intelligence. As if the enforcement of discipline could somehow delay the inevitable. Inside the tunnels, production slowed drastically, materials dwindled, supervision weakened, and the vast underground chambers echoed not only with machinery but with tension, as skeletal men assembled components for a war that had already moved beyond them, aware that liberation might arrive too late for many whose bodies were already beyond recovery. Discussions among prisoners grew more urgent, leaders within clandestine networks debating whether to risk uprising or conserve strength, weighing the danger of premature rebellion against the possibility that SS units might choose mass killing over surrender. And such fears were not unfounded, because in other camps forced evacuations had turned into death marches, columns of prisoners driven across collapsing territories with little food or shelter, and many at Gusen braced themselves for the same fate. However, geography and speed altered the outcome as American armored divisions advanced rapidly through Upper Austria, cutting off organized evacuation plans and compressing the time available for systematic destruction of evidence. On the 5th of May 1945, units of the U.S. 11th Armored Division reached the Mauthausen complex and its subcamps, including Gusen, encountering not a fortified battlefield but a landscape of emaciated figures behind barbed wire, watchtowers still manned yet wavering, SS guards either fleeing or surrendering with startling abruptness. The gates did not open with ceremony but with confusion, commands shouted in languages prisoners scarcely understood, and the sight of unfamiliar uniforms that at first seemed almost unreal, because for years the world beyond fences had felt abstract, distant, perhaps even imaginary. Liberation, however, did not instantly reverse suffering, for many prisoners were too weak to stand, too ill to process relief, and medical teams faced the daunting task of stabilizing thousands suffering from advanced starvation and rampant disease, careful not to trigger fatal shock through sudden overfeeding. Barracks revealed rows of bodies that had not yet been buried, tunnels exposed workspaces where tools lay abandoned mid-task, and documentation uncovered fragments of administrative records that testified to the camp's industrial role within the Nazi war economy. For American soldiers, the encounter carried profound psychological impact, because Gusen did not resemble a conventional military objective but rather a revelation of systemic cruelty embedded within infrastructure, and photographs taken in those days would later circulate as evidence in war crimes proceedings, shaping global understanding of what had occurred behind seemingly ordinary industrial facades. Yet even in liberation there existed ambiguity, because some guards blended into civilian populations, escaping immediate accountability, while others were detained for interrogation, and the process of justice would unfold slowly, unevenly, across years. Survivors faced their own uncertain future, displaced persons without homes to return to, many discovering that families had vanished, communities erased, and the physical freedom granted in May 1945 carried with it the immense burden of memory. Gusen, once a site optimized for labor extraction and mortality, now stood exposed in daylight, its fences no longer symbols of total control but of a regime's collapse, and in the silence that followed the last roll call, the camp revealed the extent to which its lethality had depended not solely on overt massacres but on sustained exploitation structured into daily routine. The end of Gusen did not arrive through negotiation or gradual reform but through the swift convergence of external military force and internal disintegration, and as American forces secured the complex, the machinery that had operated with such relentless efficiency simply stopped, leaving behind tunnels carved into mountains, quarries scarred into earth, and survivors who would carry forward testimony of how a labor camp, through calculated deprivation and industrial ambition, had become one of the deadliest sections of the entire Mauthausen system, proving that even in its final chaotic days, the legacy of Gusen would not be defined solely by its collapse, but by the clarity with which it exposed the lethal logic of forced labor pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Chapter 9, Segment 1, Justice, Memory, and the Struggle to Name the Dead. When the gates of Gusen finally opened in May 1945, liberation did not bring immediate clarity. It brought shock, disbelief, and the heavy silence that follows catastrophe. American forces who entered the camp documented what they found. emaciated survivors, mass graves, abandoned tunnels, and records that hinted at a vast system of industrialized exploitation. Yet even in those first days, it became clear that Gusen would present a unique challenge to history. Unlike camps that had become internationally known symbols, Gusen existed in the shadow of Mauthausen. It was administratively a subcamp, yet in mortality and brutality it had often surpassed its parent. And because it was technically folded into a larger complex, its distinct identity risked being diluted almost immediately. In the weeks after liberation, medical units struggled to stabilize thousands of survivors suffering from extreme malnutrition, typhus, tuberculosis, and injuries sustained in quarries and tunnels. Many who had survived forced labor for years died in the days that followed, their bodies too damaged to recover. For these men, freedom arrived only as a final breath. Others slowly regained strength, and with it came the painful realization that return would not mean restoration. Families were gone. Cities were destroyed. Borders had shifted. The camp had taken years of their lives, but it had also severed them from the world they once knew. Meanwhile, Allied investigators began assembling evidence for future war crimes trials. Gusen's records, though partially destroyed, revealed the depth of its integration into the Nazi war economy. Contracts between SS authorities and private companies showed how forced labor had been monetized. Correspondence documented quotas, production targets, and the relentless expansion of underground facilities. Witness testimonies described beatings, starvation rations, executions, and the systematic destruction of human beings under the guise of productivity. What emerged was not the image of a chaotic battlefield prison, but of a meticulously organized industrial enterprise, one that converted prisoners into expendable units of labor until they collapsed. The Mauthausen trials, held under American military jurisdiction, addressed crimes committed across the broader camp complex, including Gusen. Several SS officers, guards, and capos were prosecuted, and some were sentenced to death or imprisonment. Yet justice, though visible, was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution, blending back into civilian life during the confusion of post-war Europe. Others benefited from shifting political priorities as the Cold War began to reshape global alliances. For survivors, the trials offered validation but not closure. No verdict could restore what had been lost. As Austria rebuilt itself in the post-war years, memory became complicated. The nation often portrayed itself as the first victim of Nazi aggression following the Anschluss of 1938. In this narrative, sites like Mauthausen received official recognition as symbols of suffering and warning. But Gusen's identity remained less visible. Its land was gradually repurposed. Residential houses were built over former barracks grounds. Industrial structures were dismantled. The tunnels, once carved by starving prisoners, remained hidden within the hills. Without deliberate preservation, memory risked erosion. Survivors, however, refused silence. Through memoirs, testimonies, and commemorative associations, they insisted that Gusen be remembered not as a footnote, but as one of the most lethal labor complexes in the Nazi system. Historians began to analyze mortality data more closely, revealing that in certain periods, Gusen's death rates exceeded those of the main Mauthausen camp. Scholars examined the economics of forced labor, tracing how German industry relied on camps like Gusen to sustain wartime production. The narrative expanded beyond isolated brutality to expose structural complicity. In later decades, grassroots movements and international organizations pushed for proper memorialization of the Gusen sites. Monuments were erected. Research centers compiled names. Educational programs sought to teach new generations about the dangers of systems that normalize exploitation and dehumanization. Yet challenges persisted, as portions of the former campgrounds remained privately owned or altered beyond recognition. The physical traces of suffering had been partially erased, making the work of remembrance dependent on documentation and testimony rather than architecture alone. The struggle to name the dead became central to this process. Tens of thousands passed through Gusen I, II, and III. Many perished without formal records. Reconstructing identities required cross-referencing transport lists, survivor accounts, and fragmented archives scattered across Europe. Each recovered name represented more than data. It restored individuality to a person once reduced to a number. In a camp designed to erase identity through labor and exhaustion, the act of naming became resistance against forgetting. Over time, Gusen's story contributed to broader discussions about how industrial systems can be weaponized against human dignity. It challenged simplistic distinctions between concentration camps and extermination camps, demonstrating that forced labor, when combined with starvation and abuse, could achieve mortality levels comparable to more overt killing centers. It revealed how bureaucratic language masked cruelty, how economic incentives reinforced brutality, and how ordinary administrative processes could sustain extraordinary violence. Today, when visitors walk through what remains of Gusen, they encounter a landscape that appears deceptively ordinary. Houses stand where barracks once held thousands. Grass grows over foundations where prisoners slept 3 to a bunk. The tunnels remain dark and cold, silent witnesses to years of suffering. Without context, the sight might seem unremarkable. With knowledge, it becomes one of the most haunting examples of how modern infrastructure can conceal atrocity. Chapter 9 begins not with liberation alone, but with the question of what follows. How does a society confront a place that was both industrial hub and death trap? How do courts measure crimes that unfolded through daily routine rather than singular massacre? And how do survivors ensure that Gusen, once overshadowed, claims its rightful place in the history of the Holocaust? The answers lie in memory, research, and vigilance. Gusen did not end in 1945. Its physical operations stopped, but its lessons continue. They warn that systems built on dehumanization do not collapse on their own. They expand, normalize, and entrench themselves unless challenged. In remembering Gusen, we do more than recount statistics. We examine the mechanisms that allowed a labor camp to become deadlier than its parent, and we confront the enduring responsibility to ensure that such mechanisms are recognized long before they reach the point of irreversible harm. Chapter 9, Segment 2: Industrial Complicity and the Economics of Death. By the time the war turned decisively against Germany, the industrial system that had consumed Gusen's prisoners was too deeply embedded to unravel quickly, and as investigators began to follow the paper trail after liberation, what they uncovered was not merely a record of brutality but a network of contracts, invoices, and production quotas that tied the camp directly to some of the most advanced weapons projects of the Third Reich, revealing that Gusen's lethality was not an accidental byproduct of neglect but the logical consequence of an economic model that measured human value in output per day. Companies and state ministries had calculated how many prisoners could be driven through a quarry shift, how many hours could be extracted inside underground tunnels assembling aircraft components, and how long a malnourished body could endure before collapse. And in these calculations, mortality was not a moral concern but a logistical variable, one that could be offset by the arrival of fresh transports from occupied territories, ensuring that the labor force remained numerically sufficient even as individuals died in staggering numbers. The quarries that had first defined Gusen I were only the beginning, because as Allied bombing intensified and German leadership sought to move critical industries underground, Gusen II and later Gusen III expanded into vast tunnel complexes carved directly into the rock, where prisoners labored in darkness, inhaling dust and fumes, sleeping in damp caverns before returning to shifts that blurred day and night into a continuous cycle of exhaustion. And in these subterranean spaces, the boundary between factory and execution ground dissolved entirely, since starvation rations combined with punishing workloads meant that each completed fuselage or engine part was shadowed by another body carried away to a growing pile of the dead. The integration of private industry into the system exposed a level of complicity that extended far beyond uniformed SS guards, because corporate managers negotiated directly with camp authorities, requested increased deliveries of prisoners when output targets were missed, and accepted without recorded protest the knowledge that turnover was maintained through death. And though some post-war trials would examine individual responsibility, the broader economic culture that enabled such arrangements proved harder to prosecute, especially as Cold War priorities shifted attention toward rebuilding Europe rather than dissecting every strand of collaboration. Within Gusen itself, prisoners understood that they were not merely captives but components, assigned identification numbers that corresponded to work details, moved between quarry, construction site, and assembly line as if transferred between departments of a single enterprise, and this reduction of identity to function deepened the psychological destruction already inflicted by hunger and violence, reinforcing the message that their worth was measured solely by how much granite they could haul or how precisely they could fit parts destined for weapons that would never change the outcome of the war. Mortality records from Gusen reveal periods in which death rates surged dramatically as tunnel construction intensified, suggesting that the push for underground production accelerated the camp's transformation into a site of attrition, and survivors later described how the most coveted assignment was not the one that promised skill or dignity but the one that offered marginally better odds of survival, perhaps a position indoors away from freezing winds or a task that allowed brief contact with other prisoners who could share scraps of bread or fragments of news. Yet even amid this industrial machine, small acts of resistance persisted, from subtle sabotage of parts to clandestine sharing of information, reminders that the system, though vast, could never fully extinguish human agency. When liberation halted production, the tunnels fell silent, and Allied observers confronted not only evidence of mass death but of a chilling experiment in total mobilization, where economic efficiency and ideological hatred had merged into a single apparatus, demonstrating that genocide in the Nazi system did not operate solely through overt killing centers but also through labor regimes structured so harshly that survival became statistically improbable. In the decades that followed, historians would debate how to categorize Gusen, whether as a subcamp or an autonomous center of destruction, but the economic analysis left little doubt that it functioned as one of the most lethal nodes in the Reich's war economy, a place where corporate demand and SS control converged, and understanding this convergence remains essential because it illustrates how ordinary mechanisms of procurement, scheduling, and cost accounting can, under a regime of dehumanization, sustain extraordinary cruelty, reminding us that the story of Gusen is not only about brutality inflicted by guards but about a broader system that converted suffering into production metrics, proving that when profit, power, and prejudice align, the result can be a machinery of death that operates with the cold logic of industry itself. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Collapse, Death Marches, and the Final Reckoning. As the Reich began to fracture under the weight of advancing Allied armies, the lethal system that had defined Gusen did not immediately loosen its grip, but instead entered one of its most chaotic and deadly phases, because retreat did not mean mercy and collapse did not mean reprieve. And in the early months of 1945, the SS authorities overseeing the Mauthausen, Gusen complex faced a decision that had already been repeated across the camp network: whether to abandon the prisoners where they stood or to evacuate them deeper into territory still under German control. And the answer, shaped by a mixture of fanaticism, fear of testimony, and bureaucratic reflex, was to move them, to push skeletal men out of the tunnels and quarries and onto roads that cut through Austria and southern Germany, forcing them into columns that would soon be known as death marches. Those who were still assigned to underground production at Gusen II and III found themselves driven from the caverns that had consumed so many lives, lined up despite fever, starvation, and untreated injuries, and ordered to march with little food, minimal clothing, and guards whose patience had thinned into brutality. And as these columns stretched along the countryside, Civilians sometimes watched in silence while others offered furtive gestures of water or bread, small acts that could invite punishment if seen. The mortality that had defined Gusen's daily routine now followed the prisoners into open fields and village roads, because those who stumbled were beaten, those who collapsed were shot, and those too weak to rise were left where they fell, transforming the landscape itself into an extension of the camp. Within Gusen proper, conditions deteriorated rapidly as overcrowding intensified and supplies vanished, since transports from other camps had already swelled the population beyond capacity, and disease spread unchecked through barracks where sanitation had long ago broken down, making the final weeks a convergence of starvation, typhus, and exhaustion. The administrative order that once calculated labor quotas gave way to panic. Yet even in panic, the impulse to erase evidence remained. Files were destroyed, attempts were made to conceal records, and some guards fled while others clung to their posts, uncertain whether loyalty would protect them or doom them. When American forces approached the Mauthausen Gusen complex in early May 1945, they encountered not a functioning industrial hub but a landscape suspended between abandonment and catastrophe, and the soldiers who entered were confronted by survivors whose bodies bore the unmistakable marks of systematic deprivation. Men so emaciated that liberation itself posed a medical challenge, because sudden access to food risked fatal shock to organs weakened by months or years of hunger. Within the tunnels and barracks lay the silent testimony of what had taken place. Stacks of the dead who had not lived long enough to march, tools and machinery left idle, and the oppressive air of spaces that had been carved into mountains by forced labor. The liberation of Gusen did not immediately bring clarity or justice, but it did bring documentation, photographs, medical reports, and testimonies that would feed into post-war investigations and trials, including proceedings that sought to hold SS personnel accountable for crimes committed within the Mauthausen Gusen system, though many perpetrators escaped, blending back into civilian life or disappearing in the chaos of defeat. For survivors, liberation marked the beginning of another struggle, the struggle to recover physically, to trace lost family members, to decide whether to return to homelands that had been destroyed or transformed, and to carry memories of tunnels, quarries, and death marches into a world that could scarcely comprehend their scale. In the decades that followed, Gusen's specific identity was at times overshadowed by its association with Mauthausen, yet research into mortality rates, labor assignments, and camp expansion has continued to underscore how deadly this complex had become, revealing that for thousands, Gusen was not a subcamp but the final destination. Today, the remnants of foundations and the preserved memorial sites stand as quiet markers on landscapes that once echoed with commands and the grind of stone, and the story of Gusen's final months serves as a reminder that systems built on exploitation rarely dissolve gently. They convulse, they scatter victims across roads and fields, and they leave behind questions about responsibility that echo long after the machinery has stopped. To understand how Gusen became deadlier than its parent camp is to recognize that its lethality was not confined to a single method of killing but embedded in structure, expansion, industrial demand, and a refusal to concede defeat even as the regime crumbled. And in those last marches and those last days before liberation, the full cost of that system became visible, etched into the bodies of survivors and into the memory of a continent struggling to comprehend how organized labor had been transformed into a pathway to mass death. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Numbers Behind the Deadliness. To understand how Gusen became deadlier than Mauthausen, we have to step away from individual images of tunnels and quarries and look directly at the numbers, because mortality rates reveal patterns that brutality alone cannot fully explain. And when historians began comparing prisoner registers, transport lists, work assignments, and post-war testimonies, a disturbing picture emerged. Proportionally, prisoners sent to Gusen, especially Gusen I in its early Quarry phase and later Gusen II during the underground rocket production era, faced a significantly higher chance of dying within a shorter span of time than many categories of prisoners held at Mauthausen proper. This was not accidental, nor was it merely the byproduct of overcrowding, but rather the outcome of structural decisions made at multiple levels of SS administration, decisions that classified Gusen as a site for prisoners considered incorrigible or politically dangerous, meaning that men transferred there were often already marked as expendable within the camp hierarchy. From its establishment in 1940, Gusen was assigned some of the harshest labor details in the granite quarries, where the combination of steep terrain, primitive tools, and relentless production quotas created an environment in which injuries were constant and recovery time non-existent, and unlike at some other camps where limited skilled labor might offer marginal protection, quarry work provided almost no path to survival because productivity was measured in stone blocks extracted, not in the preservation of human strength. When the war intensified and Gusen II was constructed to support the relocation of armaments production underground after Allied bombing campaigns, mortality did not decrease in the name of industrial efficiency as one might expect, but instead escalated in new forms because the urgency to produce aircraft components and V-weapon parts in subterranean factories led to extended shifts in air thick. With dust, insufficient ventilation, and minimal protective equipment, conditions that accelerated respiratory illness, exhaustion, and collapse. Records from late 1943 and 1944 show transport arrivals of thousands of prisoners from across occupied Europe: Poles, Spanish Republicans, Soviet POWs, French resistance members, Hungarian Jews, and the death registers that follow those arrivals often reveal staggering attrition within weeks or months, a pattern that indicates not simply harsh conditions but a calculated acceptance of high turnover. SS administrators coordinated closely with industrial firms, including those connected to Messerschmitt and other armaments producers, and this partnership embedded Gusen more deeply into the Nazi war economy than many realize. Yet unlike a modern industrial system concerned with workforce sustainability, the camp relied on constant replenishment from transports, treating prisoners as consumable resources. Comparisons between Mauthausen and Gusen during peak operational years suggest that while both camps were lethal, the concentration of the most punishing labor details, the tight integration with high-priority weapons production, and the categorization of Gusen as a place for hard cases combined to create mortality ratios that in some periods surpassed those of the main camp, especially among specific national groups who were disproportionately assigned to the worst tasks. Moreover, the expansion into multiple subsections, Gusen I, II, and III, did not distribute suffering evenly but layered it, with each expansion absorbing new prisoner populations under deteriorating logistical conditions, meaning food supplies, medical facilities, and housing lagged behind population growth, amplifying the effects of starvation and disease. Historians have also noted that administrative distance played a role, because Gusen's somewhat separate management allowed certain practices to intensify with less immediate oversight, including extreme punishments and selection processes that removed the weakest prisoners from work details and funneled them toward death through neglect or execution. The result was a camp complex where survival curves were brutally short for many categories of inmates, particularly during the height of underground production, and where the statistical probability of death became embedded in the structure itself. When we analyze Gusen's lethality in comparison to Mauthausen, we are not diminishing the horror of the parent camp but recognizing that within the same broader system, specific nodes were engineered, through classification, labor allocation, industrial integration, and administrative autonomy, to operate with even greater intensity, and by tracing these numbers carefully, we see that Gusen's reputation as the deadliest section was not born from anecdote alone but from measurable patterns of loss that reveal how industrial demand, ideological categorization, and bureaucratic calculation converged to make Gusen a site where death was not only frequent but statistically expected. Chapter 10, Segment 2: Collapse, Evacuation, and the Final Surge in Deaths. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, Gusen did not become less lethal. In fact, the opposite occurred, because the final months of the camp's existence produced a surge in mortality that was driven not only by exhaustion and starvation but by administrative panic, logistical breakdown, and the deliberate decision to continue production at all costs even as the Reich collapsed around it. Allied bombing had already forced much of the armaments industry. Underground and Gusen's tunnel systems were still being expanded and used deep into the winter of 1944 to 45, meaning prisoners were compelled to work in freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing while food rations shrank further as transport routes faltered. At the same time, evacuation transports from camps further east, particularly from Auschwitz and other threatened sites, pushed thousands of additional prisoners into the already overcrowded Gusen complex, creating barracks so congested that bunks designed for 1 or 2 men held 4 or 5, and the spread of disease, especially dysentery and typhus, accelerated rapidly in spaces where sanitation had effectively collapsed. The SS administration, rather than scaling back operations to stabilize conditions, intensified work quotas in an attempt to salvage military production, and prisoners who could not maintain pace were subjected to beatings, selections, or transfers to punishment details that were essentially death sentences because medical care was nearly non-existent and infirmaries lacked supplies, staff, and even basic isolation capacity. By early 1945, crematoria could not keep up with the number of dead, and bodies accumulated in and around the camp, a grim indicator that the system's lethal pressure had reached its peak. Meanwhile, orders circulated across the camp network to prevent prisoners from being liberated as witnesses, leading to preparations for forced evacuations and death marches. And, although Gusen was not evacuated as early as some other camps, planning for potential liquidation created additional terror within the prisoner population, who sensed that survival chances were shrinking by the day. Testimonies from survivors describe an atmosphere in which exhaustion became absolute, where men collapsed not only from hunger but from the psychological knowledge that the regime's collapse might not bring relief before their bodies failed. When American forces finally approached in May 1945, they encountered a camp complex that was still functioning on paper but hollowed out by death, with thousands of prisoners in critical condition and production facilities littered with evidence of frantic, unfinished labor. Liberation did not instantly reverse the toll, because many prisoners were too weakened to recover, and post-liberation deaths continued for days and weeks as medical teams struggled to treat starvation and infection. In examining this final phase, historians note that the mortality spike at Gusen during the last months underscores how its lethal character was not confined to earlier quarry brutality or underground rocket production alone, but intensified under collapse, revealing a system that preferred destruction to surrender and exploitation to preservation until the very last hour. This terminal surge in death cements Gusen's reputation as more than a satellite of Mauthausen. It was a focal point where industrial urgency, ideological dehumanization, and administrative desperation combined in a final, devastating crescendo of loss. Chapter 10, Segment 3, Aftermath, Memory, and the Shadow of Gusen. When the gates of Gusen finally opened in May 1945, liberation did not bring immediate clarity. It brought silence, shock, and the staggering task of understanding what had happened in a place that had functioned for years as one of the deadliest labor complexes in the Nazi system. American troops entering the camp encountered skeletal survivors, unfinished tunnel projects carved into the hillsides, abandoned machinery, and the physical evidence of mass death that had accumulated faster than the SS could conceal it. And yet in the weeks that followed, the world's attention gravitated more visibly toward other sites, leaving Gusen partially obscured within the broader narrative of Mauthausen, even though survivor testimony and post-war investigations would later confirm that mortality rates within Gusen I, II, and III had reached catastrophic levels that in many periods exceeded those of the main camp. The immediate aftermath involved emergency medical efforts, the burial of the dead, and the recording of evidence for war crimes prosecutions, but justice unfolded unevenly, as some perpetrators were tried in the Mauthausen trials while others disappeared into post-war anonymity, and the industrial companies that had benefited from forced labor navigated a complex reckoning that would stretch across decades. Survivors carried forward memories of underground tunnels, collapsing quarries, starvation barracks, and the suffocating discipline that had defined daily life. And their testimonies became the primary archive of a system that had attempted to erase itself through exhaustion rather than spectacle. Over time, parts of the Gusen campgrounds were repurposed or built over, complicating efforts to preserve the site as a memorial, and historians would later emphasize that this partial erasure mirrored the original intent of the system, to reduce human beings to expendable components and then discard both bodies and evidence once usefulness had ended. Yet despite fragmentation, memory endured, and research into mortality statistics, labor contracts, and SS administrative correspondence revealed how Gusen had evolved into a nexus where industrial exploitation and ideological annihilation overlapped with lethal efficiency. Today, the study of Gusen forces a difficult recognition that genocide can operate not only through overt mechanisms of extermination but through calibrated overwork, deprivation, and systemic indifference that produce death at scale, without the need for constant spectacle. In remembering Gusen, scholars and visitors confront the fact that its deadliest features were embedded in schedules, quotas, transport lists, and production deadlines, and that its extreme mortality was the predictable outcome of a design that treated human life as a raw material to be consumed. The shadow of Gusen lingers as a warning about how bureaucratic language can disguise cruelty, how industry can normalize exploitation, and how systems built for efficiency can become engines of destruction when stripped of moral constraint. The camp no longer operates, its tunnels stand silent, and the machinery has long since rusted, but the record remains. Names, numbers, testimonies, and the enduring responsibility to examine how such a place became possible and why its lessons must remain visible long after the structures themselves have faded into history. Gusen was not designed to be remembered. It was designed to exhaust, to erase, and to disappear into stone and silence. But memory survived where the system failed. If this documentary helped you understand how labor became a weapon and how one camp grew deadlier than its parent, then stay with us. There are more histories that must be told carefully, calmly, and completely. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue exploring the hidden systems behind history, one story at a time.